Hi guys, welcome to the Quiet Past Historical Channel. Tonight you're stepping onto a ship, not a grand vessel with flags flying and cannons gleaming. No, something older than that and quieter. A working ship. A ship that smells of salt and rope and wet timber, that groans softly in the dark the way old houses do when the wind comes through. A ship where men sleep in hammocks barely wider than their own shoulders, where the lantern at the bow casts just enough orange light to see the grain of the wooden deck, and where the ocean, that vast, indifferent, endlessly patient ocean, moves beneath everything like a breathing thing. You are not going anywhere in particular. That is not the point. The point is the night itself. The long, slow, deeply human experience of being at sea after the sun has gone down, when the work of the day is mostly done, when the ropes are coiled and the sails are trimmed and the cook has put the fire out, and all that is left is the sound of water and the stars and the soft chorus of men at rest. We are going to spend some time out here together, on the wooden decks of history, in the cabins of merchant vessels and naval frigates and fishing sloops, in the centuries before electricity made the dark less dark, before engines made the silence less silent. We are going to look at the very small, very tender, very human details of what it was actually like to live out a night on the open water. There is no battle in this story, no shipwreck, no great drama. Just the sea and the men upon it, and the night coming down like a soft cloth over everything. Come aboard. The water is calm tonight. The stars are out. Before we begin, if you are someone who enjoys spending time with quiet history like this, with the kind of storytelling that is in no hurry to get anywhere, I would gently invite you to subscribe to this channel. There are many more evenings like this one waiting for you here. You can also leave the video playing as you fall asleep, or rest, or simply sit somewhere comfortable. That is exactly what this is for. Now, let us go back. Before the sun goes down, the world of the sailing ship, to understand the nights at sea, you first have to understand the ship itself. Not in an engineering sense, not the tonnage and the rigging terminology, though we will touch on those things gently as we go. What you need to understand is the ship as a place to live, a ship as a world. Because that is what it was. From the moment a sailor stepped aboard a vessel in, say, the year 1720 or 1640 or 1580, he left the land world entirely behind. He entered a new world with its own geography, its own social order, its own language, its own rhythms of time. A ship was, in almost every meaningful sense, a village that floated. It had its hierarchy of inhabitants, from the captain who occupied his stern cabin like a lord in his hall, to the ordinary seaman who slept forward in the forecastle, which is to say the forecastle, that cramped, low-ceilinged space at the bow of the ship where the anchor chains ran and the smell of the sea was always strongest. And like any village, it had a daily life. It had routines. It had meals and work and rest and small entertainments. It had its customs and its superstitions and its quiet, unspoken agreements about how things were done. The thing that shaped all of this, the thing that organized every hour of every day and every night, was the watch system. If you have never heard of this, let me explain it slowly, because it is the skeleton on which the entire experience of a sailor's night hangs. A ship at sea needed to be operated continuously, 24 hours a day, every single day for the duration of the voyage. Someone had to be at the helm, steering. Someone had to watch the sails and call for adjustments when the wind shifted. Someone had to keep an eye on the horizon for shoals or rocks or other ships. Someone had to man the pumps because all wooden ships leaked, some more than others, some rather alarmingly, and the bilge water had to be kept manageable. Someone had to tend the fire in the cook's box, or later the iron stove, if there was to be anything warm to eat. All of this meant that the ship's crew was always divided, at any given moment, into those who were working and those who were sleeping. The formal structure that managed this division was called the watch. In the Royal Navy of the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries, and in merchant ships of the same era, following similar traditions, the day and night were divided into watches of varying lengths. The standard day was split into 5 watches of 4 hours each, plus 2 short watches of 2 hours each in the late afternoon and early evening. These short watches were called the dog watches, and they existed for a simple and very practical reason. They prevented the same men from always being on duty at the same hours. Without the dog watches, the same group would always work the midnight to 4 shift, or always work the noon to 4. The dog watches shuffled the rotation so that over the course of 2 days, the watches changed, and the burden of the worst hours was spread more evenly. The watches had names that became as natural to a sailor as the hours of the clock were to a landsman. The first watch began at 8 in the evening and ran until midnight. The middle watch ran from midnight to 4 in the morning, the deepest, darkest, coldest watch of the night, the one that separated the men who could endure from the men who struggled, the one that seemed to many sailors the longest 4 hours of their lives. The morning watch ran from 4 until 8, catching the first gray light of dawn. And then the forenoon watch from 8 to noon, and the afternoon watch from noon to 4, and then the dog watches from 4 to 6 and from 6 to 8 in the evening, and then the whole thing began again. Each of these watches had a name and each had a feeling. The experienced sailors knew them intimately. The feel of the first watch, with the sun recently down and the stars not yet fully bright, the ship still holding some warmth from the day. The feel of the morning watch, with that particular cold that comes before dawn, the sky beginning to separate itself from the sea on the eastern horizon, the strange silence of an hour when even the sea seems to be waiting for something. The watch system meant that at any moment on a ship, roughly half the crew was on deck and half was below. The ones below were officially off watch, which is to say they had 4 hours in which to eat if there was food, to talk or play cards or mend their clothes, and most importantly, to sleep. 4 hours, that was what they had, not a full night's rest, nothing like the uninterrupted 7 or 8 hours that we might consider ordinary. Just 4 hours, and then the bell would ring and the bosun's mate would come below with his call and his voice, and it would be time to get up again. This rhythm, this constant cycling of work and rest in short intervals, shaped the entire psychology of a sailor's life at sea. It shaped how they slept, how quickly they could fall asleep, how deeply. It shaped how they thought about rest. Experienced sailors were famous, or perhaps notorious is the better word, for their ability to fall asleep instantly, in any position, in any amount of noise. They had no choice but to train themselves to this. The man who lay awake for 40 minutes of his precious 4-hour off watch was the man who got only a little over 3 hours of sleep, and on a long voyage, that small deficit compounded. So sailors slept. They slept with a focused efficiency that landsmen found almost alarming. They closed their eyes and they were gone, and they came back when the bell told them to. But before we follow them below, before we go down into the forecastle and find a hammock for ourselves, let us stay on deck a little longer. Let us watch the sun go down. The sun sets differently at sea. On land, there is always something between you and the horizon, trees or buildings or hills. The sun disappears behind something before it actually reaches the line where sky meets earth. At sea, there is nothing. The horizon is a clean, unbroken line going all the way around you, a perfect circle, and the sun drops toward it with a terrible clarity. You can actually watch it move if you're patient. You can see it descend degree by degree, and when it touches the horizon it flattens slightly, a visual effect of the atmosphere, and then it slides under and the color happens. The color happens slowly and then all at once. First there is the orange, deep and warm along the western horizon. Then, above it, a band of gold fading into a pale, clear yellow. Higher still, the sky begins to hold a thin, pure green, the sort of green you almost never see in the sky, like the inside of a piece of sea glass. And then blue, deepening by the second, and above that the first star, always one star before the others, appearing so suddenly that you are never sure whether it was always there and you only just noticed it, or whether it truly just arrived. Sailors of earlier centuries watched sunsets for practical reasons. The color and character of the western sky gave information about the coming night. Red sky in the evening, the old saying was older than any ship that ever floated. Pink and orange without excessive streaking of cloud, a calm night was likely. A sky full of wild, dark red along the horizon, wind coming. The clouds on the western horizon at sunset were read like a text, slowly, carefully, by officers and experienced sailors who had learned that the sky never lies exactly, but it does sometimes mislead. As the sun went down, the ship changed. During the day, a sailing ship was a loud, busy, visually complicated place. There were men aloft in the rigging, climbing the shrouds, moving along the yards, adjusting sails, making repairs. There were men on deck coiling lines and swabbing planking, and working the pumps and carrying things from one place to another. There were voices, orders being given and acknowledged, the rhythmic chanting of sailors hauling on a line together, a sound so distinctive, so old, that it could have come from any period of sail: Phoenician galleys, Roman warships, Portuguese caravels, British frigates. The work chant was universal because the need was universal. When many men had to pull on something at the same time, someone had to set the rhythm, and singing was the most natural way to do it. But in the evening, as the last of the dog watches ended and the first watch began, the ship grew quieter. The big work of the day was done. The sails were set for the night, usually a reduced spread of canvas, because changing sails in darkness was difficult and sometimes dangerous, and so unless the weather changed dramatically, you carried what you had. The pumps had been worked, the ropes were coiled. The cook's fire, which had been lit only during specific hours to prevent the nightmare of fire at sea, was now banked or extinguished entirely. The cook himself, the ship's cook, that particular figure of shipboard society, had already distributed the evening meal, such as it was. We will spend a great deal of time with food later. For now, just know that the last meal of the day had been eaten, and the wooden bowls and tin cups had been cleaned as best they could be, and the galley, the ship's kitchen, a small enclosed space usually situated in the lower decks, was cooling down. The men of the incoming first watch took up their stations. At the helm, one man stood with his hands on the wooden spokes of the wheel. He was not necessarily steering vigorously. In fair winds on a steady course, the wheel could almost hold itself, and a light touch was all that was needed to keep the compass needle where the officer of the watch required it. But his hands were always on the wheel. That was the rule. The helmsman did not leave the wheel. The helmsman kept his eyes on the compass mounted before him, or on the sails, particularly the upper sails, whose edges would begin to flutter if the course drifted even slightly off the wind. The helmsman listened to the ship. The ship spoke to you if you knew how to listen. A slight change in the sound of the water along the hull, a different vibration in the wheel itself, a barely perceptible slackening in the sails. These were the language of the ship, and a good helmsman heard every word. Forward on the bow, the lookout stood or sat, depending on the conditions. In good weather, he might sit on the bowsprit, the long spar extending forward from the bow over the water, with his legs dangling and his eyes scanning the darkness ahead. In rough weather, he would stand back from the bow and hold onto something while the ship rose and fell beneath him, spray coming over the rail, and still he watched. Still he watched. Because the thing ahead of the ship, the rock, the reef, the unseen coast, the other vessel running without lights, that thing would not announce itself. You had to find it, and finding it in time was the difference between a voyage continuing and a voyage ending. Scattered around the rest of the deck, the remaining men of the watch went about their tasks in the darkness, moving with the confident ease of men who have memorized every rope and cleat and hatch cover. A sailor on a familiar ship could navigate the deck in complete darkness, and often did. He knew where every line was belayed. He knew the exact height of every piece of raised deck furniture, every hatch coming, every pin rail, every coil of rope. He moved through the darkness of his ship the way you move through the darkness of your own bedroom, with the unhurried confidence of intimate knowledge. And now, below decks, the watch that has just come off duty begins the process of becoming human again. The world below into the forecastle coming below from the deck at night was a sensory transition that no amount of description quite captures, though we can come close. First, there was the hatch. You found the hatch cover, a low wooden frame over a ladder leading down, and you lifted it, and a particular smell came up at you. Every sailor knew this smell. It was the smell of their home for the duration of the voyage. It was the smell of unwashed men sleeping in close quarters, of damp wool, of the oakum that was packed between the planks to keep the water out, of the bilge below, that dark, perpetually damp space at the very bottom of the ship, where water collected and sat and mixed with the residue of whatever the ship carried. On a merchant ship carrying dried fish or hides or tar, the smell had its own distinctive character. On a naval vessel, particularly one that had been at sea for some weeks without touching land, the smell was something that took getting used to, and then you got used to it, and eventually you stopped noticing it at all. You climbed down the ladder. The headroom below was not generous. On many ships, particularly in earlier centuries, a man of average height could not stand fully upright. He bent slightly or walked with his head forward automatically without thinking. The timbers of the deckhead, the underside of the deck above you, were close enough to touch, and they wept slightly, because all wood at sea is always faintly damp, and because every wave that came aboard left some of its water behind. The forecastle, where the ordinary seaman lived, was at the very front of the ship, below the main deck. It was, in almost every account written by sailors from the age of sail, described as dark. Even during the day, was dark. The only light came from the hatch when it was open, and from a small oil lamp, a slush lamp, often fueled by the grease skimmed off the top of the cooking pot, that burned with a tiny, inadequate flame and produced as much smoke as it did light. At night, the forecastle was lit by the single lamp and nothing else, unless some sailor had his own candle stump, which was carefully hoarded and used only when truly necessary. In this dim, close, swaying, fragrant space, the hammocks were slung. A hammock was a rectangle of canvas, roughly 6 feet long and about 2 feet wide, with ropes at each end attached to hooks in the beams above. When a man climbed in, it folded around him like a loose cocoon, and the gentle swaying of the ship made it rock slightly, which most sailors found deeply comfortable, at least after the first few nights of adjustment. The hammocks were slung close together. Regulations in the Royal Navy specified 14 inches of horizontal space per man. 14 inches. This is less than the width of your shoulders. It was enough just barely, because the hammocks were staggered in height, alternating high and low, so that the feet of one man lay beside the hips of the next. In this arrangement, there was warmth. On a cold night in the North Atlantic, or rounding the Horn, or anywhere that the wind came off the water with a January edge to it, the body heat of 30 men sleeping close together was not nothing. It was, in fact, considerable. The forecastle was cold when the men were on deck and warm when they were sleeping, and a sailor coming below after a 4-hour watch in bitter wind would feel that warmth rise up from the hatch as he descended, and the relief of it was physical, almost muscular. In their hammocks, men kept their belongings. A sailor's possessions were few and carefully arranged. Regulations and custom between them had sorted out how things were stored. A sailor's chest, if he had one, not all did, particularly in earlier centuries, was usually kept below in the hold. In his hammock or on a hook nearby, he might keep his jacket, his spare shirt if he had one, the small personal items that sailors valued. A pipe, a knife, a few coins, perhaps a locket with a portrait, perhaps a small book. Books at sea are worth pausing over. Literacy among common sailors was less universal than we might assume, particularly before the 19th century. But it was also less rare than we might assume. The church schools and charity schools of England, Scotland, and the maritime nations of Europe had created a generation by generation slowly expanding population of men who could read at least a little, and the sea was not entirely without its readers. A ship's library in the 18th century was usually whatever individual officers and men happened to bring aboard, and it could be surprisingly varied. Bibles were common, the Bible being, for centuries, the primary text that literate working people were exposed to and the book most likely to be owned. Navigation manuals were present in the officers' cabins, but there were also, here and there, novels Defoe, Fielding, Smollett, Richardson, read and passed around and discussed with the kind of close attention that people give books when they have nothing else to read and a great deal of time to read them. The sailors who could not read often listened. They sat near someone who could, and in the dim lamplight of the forecastle, a man might read aloud from whatever book he had, in a low voice that did not carry past the hammocks, while the ship moved beneath them all and the watch above walked the deck in the dark. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We are still in the early part of the night, and there is much to cover before we reach the small, quiet details of men asleep. Let us first spend some time with the sounds. The sounds of a ship at night are unlike anything else. You are aware of them most acutely when you are first below, or when something wakes you at 2 in the morning and you lie still in your hammock and simply listen. The ship is speaking. It has been speaking since it left port, and it will speak until it arrives somewhere new, and the language it speaks is the language of wood and water and wind. The hull is the loudest part of this language. The planking moves. Not dramatically, not alarmingly. A well-built ship in ordinary seas is not flexing in any way you can see. But wood is not rigid, and a long hull in motion on water is subject to stresses that the builders understood and designed for, and the response of the wood to these stresses is sound. A low, deep, rhythmic groaning, a faint creaking, present always, rising and falling with the motion of the waves. When the ship rolled that long, slow side-to-side motion that was the characteristic movement of a sailing vessel in an open sea, the sounds shifted and deepened. When it came back upright, they lightened. The rigging sang. This is almost literally true. The standing rigging, the permanent ropes that held the masts in place, was always under tension, and when the wind blew, it vibrated and the vibration produced sound. In a light breeze, it was a soft hum, barely audible. In a fresh wind, it rose in pitch and volume until it became something almost musical. In a gale, it was a sustained, variable scream that could last for hours and left men slightly changed by the end of it. But on a calm night with a light wind, the rigging's voice was almost soothing, a low, continuous note that seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the air itself were alive, the water along the hull. This was a sound you heard most clearly when lying in your hammock with one ear near the ship's side, which was most of the time, given how close the hammocks were to the planking. The water moved in slow, rhythmic surges along the outside of the hull, and you could hear it intimately, just inches from your face. On a quiet night, it was a gentle, persistent shushing, like breathing. When the ship was moving well and the bow wave was clear, there was a sharper, more lively sound forward, the water being pushed aside, parted, sent back in a curl of white foam that was visible from the bow as a pale line of brightness in the dark. From below, you heard this as a continuous, rapid slapping mixed with a deeper surge, the two rhythms slightly out of phase, weaving in and out of each other. The pumps, if they were working. Ships were pumped on a schedule, not just when they seemed to be taking on water, because by the time the bilge was visibly rising, it was already a problem. The pumps were worked by hand, 2 men on each handle, pushing down and pulling up in alternation, the water lifting from the bilge and discharging through a pipe over the side. The sound of the pumps was a rhythmic, slightly wet mechanical sound, not unpleasant, exactly, but very present and noticeable below when someone was working them on deck. Footsteps, the deck watch walking, the officer of the watch pacing. This was a sound that came through the deckhead above the forecastle as a series of dull, deliberate thuds, muffled by the thickness of the planking, but regular and reassuring. Regular footsteps above meant someone was on watch and paying attention. It meant the ship was being looked after. Sailors sleeping below could hear the watch pacing and know, without fully waking, that everything was as it should be. And then the bell. Every half hour, someone struck the ship's bell. Once for the first half hour of the watch, twice for the first full hour, and so on up to 8 bells at the end of the 4-hour watch, and then back to 1 bell when the new watch began. The bell was a small bronze instrument, hung near the helm, and it was struck with a small hammer, and its sound, high, clear, carrying, traveled through the entire ship. Men sleeping below heard the bell in their sleep. Sailors who had been at sea for any length of time incorporated the bell into their unconscious rhythms, the way a city person incorporates distant church bells. It was part of the acoustic texture of being alive in that place, in that time. And as the night deepens and the first watch finds its rhythm above, let us go a little further below. Let us find the spaces where the officers live and understand the very different quality of their nights. The OFFICRS world, CABINS and Candlelight, a naval ship, or a large merchant vessel, was a society with very clear class distinctions, and nowhere were those distinctions more clearly expressed than in the sleeping arrangements. The captain's cabin was at the stern, the back of the ship, occupying the full width of the hull at that point, and it was by far the most spacious and private space on board. In a large frigate or ship of the line, it might be a genuinely comfortable room, with windows across the stern that let in light and air, with a fixed bed rather than a hammock, with space for a desk and chairs and a table for dining. The great cabin of a first-rate ship of the line, the largest class of warship in the 18th century Royal Navy, was occasionally described by visitors from ashore as more comfortable than many rooms they had occupied on land. But we are interested in the night version of this room, by candlelight. The captain's day cabin in the evening was lit by the same candles or oil lamps that lit any private room of the period, which is to say, dimly. The flickering light was warm and unsteady. It caught the grain of the polished wood and threw moving shadows across the overhead beams. The windows at the stern, if the weather was fair, might be open, and the night air would come in carrying its salt and darkness, moving the flame and making the shadows shift. The captain worked here in the evenings. He wrote in his log, a daily requirement, a record of the ship's position, the weather, the course sailed, any incidents of note. He wrote letters, though there was no way to send them until the ship touched port. He checked the charts and compared them with the navigator's log and thought about the days ahead. He might receive the first lieutenant or the sailing master for a brief consultation about the night orders, the specific instructions for the officer of the watch, what course to sail, what speed to aim for, when to call the captain if conditions changed. Naval captains of the age of sail were, by the nature of their position, often lonely men. They lived in a perpetual slight separation from everyone else aboard. They were not friends with their officers, or rather, they might feel friendly toward them privately, but the professional relationship required a certain formal distance. They could not eat regularly in the wardroom, which was the officers' mess. They could not simply sit among the men and talk. The authority of the captain was the emotional and moral spine of the ship, and that authority was maintained partly by a cultivated distance, a slight elevation above ordinary human interaction. So the captain's evening, after the business of the day was complete, was often spent alone, reading, writing, sometimes drinking wine or port, alone at his table, with the sea outside the windows and the sounds of the ship around him. Many captains describe this solitude as one of the more bearable aspects of the position, and also as one of the more difficult. There was nobody to talk to, not really, not in the unconstrained way that talking to a friend required. There were professional conversations, and there was solitude, and that was the captain's world. He slept in a fixed bed in most ships, a sort of wooden shelf with a lip to prevent him rolling out in rough weather, lined with whatever mattress or cushion could be obtained. Some captains slept in a swinging cot hung from the overhead, which moved with the ship and provided the same rocking comfort as a hammock. The captain's sleeping space was often curtained off from the day cabin, providing a degree of privacy that was entirely theoretical given the thin walls and close proximity of the officers' spaces. The cabin was not silent. The captain lay in his swinging cot or wooden bed and heard everything the ship was doing. He heard the watch above him walking the quarterdeck. He heard the compass man's quiet reports to the officer of the watch. He heard the bell. And he was, this is the strange thing, never quite fully off duty. Even asleep, a portion of the experienced captain's attention remained tuned to the sounds of his ship, alert for the particular quality of a shout above that meant something was wrong, for the change in the ship's motion that meant the wind had shifted suddenly, for the absence of sound that sometimes preceded a squall. Captains were awakened in the night frequently enough that they slept in a particular way, ready and yet resting. Below and forward of the captain's great cabin, behind a paneled partition, was the wardroom. The wardroom was the officer's mess. It was a shared space running the width of the ship on what was often called the gun deck, a level below the main deck, and it served as dining room, sitting room, and the place where the various commissioned and warrant officers had their cabins. These cabins, called sleeping cabins, were tiny. They were, quite literally, wooden boxes large enough for a swinging cot, a small chest, and almost nothing else. The door of each cabin opened into the wardroom. In the evenings, the officers gathered in the wardroom proper, the open central space, to eat and talk. The wardroom in the evening was lit again by candles or oil lamps, and the light in there was rather better than in the forecastle, because officers were officers and they had somewhat greater access to lamp, oil, and candle stubs. The table in the center of the wardroom was a long affair, surrounded by whatever chairs and benches could be made to fit, and in the evenings the officers gathered there with varying degrees of enthusiasm, depending on the quality of the voyage and the personalities involved. Wardroom life is one of the more fascinating small stories of the age of sail, because you were dealing with a group of highly trained professional men, confined together in a very small space for months at a time, with no possibility of separation or escape. The social dynamics that developed in wardrooms ranged from warm camaraderie to carefully managed mutual antipathy, with every possible variation in between. There are accounts of wardrooms where the officers barely spoke at all, where they sat at the same table for dinner in complete silence, by unspoken agreement, because the alternative was conflict. There are accounts of wardrooms where the conversations were lively and intelligent, and the evenings passed pleasantly. The ship itself, its captain, its mission, and the personalities of the individuals involved were the variables that determined which kind of wardroom you ended up in. By 9 or 10 in the evening, the wardroom was usually quieter. Officers whose watches were due at midnight had gone to their cabins early, needing whatever sleep they could get before the bosun's mate came to shake them awake. Others might still be sitting up, talking or reading by lamplight. The doctor might be writing up his notes on the sick list. The purser might be working through his accounts. These men had their own peculiar relationship with the sea night. They were not always on watch, were not always required at particular hours, and so had somewhat more flexibility in their evenings than the watch-keeping officers. The candles burned low. The ship moved beneath them all, and one by one the officers would rise from the wardroom table, take their lamp or their candle, and go into their tiny sleeping cabins and close the door. The door was 6 inches from the end of their cot. That is not an exaggeration. These were boxes, but they were private boxes, and privacy at sea was so scarce that even this sliver of it was valued enormously. An officer closing the door of his sleeping cabin was shutting out the sounds of the wardroom and the ship as much as the thin wooden partition allowed, which was not much, and creating a space that was, however briefly, his own. He lay in his swinging cot. Above him, the deckhead beams moved slightly in the lamp's last light as he blew it out. The darkness was complete. The sounds of the ship came through the wood on all sides. The hull groaned, the rigging sang, the water moved. The bell struck 4 times, then silence, then 5. He slept. Food, and the feeling of evening we should spend some time with food. Not because the food on sailing ships was particularly good. It was not, for the most part, and we will be honest about this, but because the ritual of eating was one of the central organizing events of the sailor's day, and the evening meal in particular carried a particular weight. It marked the transition from day to night. It was the moment when the work of the day officially wound down and the quiet routine of the night watch began. The cook was a significant figure on any vessel, and not merely because he controlled the food. The cook on a Royal Navy vessel was often a man who had been wounded in service, missing a hand or a foot, disabled from active duty in some way, and given the position of ship's cook as a kind of pension in kind. This meant that the quality of naval cooking varied enormously, because the qualification for the job was prior service rather than culinary skill. A man who had lost 2 fingers at Trafalgar might make an excellent cook or a terrible one, and either outcome was equally possible. On merchant vessels, the situation was somewhat more variable. The cook was hired for the position, and on larger ships with wealthier owners, the cook might actually be someone who knew what he was doing. What was available to cook was the limiting factor. Let us walk through what a sailor might eat on a typical evening on a Royal Navy ship in, say, the 1780s or 1790s. The provisions taken aboard at the beginning of a voyage were calculated by a system that the Navy Board had refined over generations. Every man was entitled to a daily ration that included certain quantities of biscuit, hardtack, the dry, dense, nearly indestructible cracker that was the staple of naval provisioning, along with salt beef or salt pork, dried peas or oatmeal, butter and cheese, and beer. Or if beer was unavailable, which it was on long voyages, because beer did not keep well, a daily ration of spirits, usually rum, which would be mixed with water to make grog. The salt beef and salt pork were stored in barrels with a great deal of salt, so much salt that the meat had to be soaked in fresh water overnight before it could be cooked and eaten. This soaking was not always as successful as intended. The meat, even after extended soaking, tended to be extremely salty and extremely tough and not particularly appetizing. Experienced sailors developed strong opinions about the relative quality of different barrels of salt beef, and a particularly good barrel was a genuine source of pleasure. On the evening in question, the cook had boiled the salt beef with whatever else was available: dried peas, onions if any remained, perhaps some pepper, perhaps nothing else, in a large copper pot hung over the fire in the galley stove. The resulting liquid was thick and heavily salted and smelled of meat and wood smoke, and it was distributed in individual portions into the wooden bowls or tin cups that each man provided for himself. With it came the hardtack, broken into pieces and sometimes soaked in the broth to soften it, and perhaps a piece of cheese. The sailors ate in messes. The mess was the basic social unit of shipboard life. It was a group of 4 to 8 men who ate together, who shared the preparation and collection of their food, who looked out for each other in the particular, practical way that close shipmates did. Messes were formed informally, by choice, and the composition of a mess reflected the social bonds on the ship. Men who liked each other, men who had sailed together before, men who were from the same town or county or country. They ate together, sitting on the deck or on their sea chests if they had them, leaning against the curve of the hull or the base of a mast. The food was not romantic. It was fuel mostly, and the men ate it with the methodical efficiency of people who needed calories and had learned to suppress any particular aesthetic response to what they were consuming. But there were moments of genuine pleasure in the eating, a particularly good portion, a piece of cheese that was less hard than expected, a cup of the broth when it was still hot, held in both hands in the chill of the evening. And there was the rum. The grog ration was a significant event in the sailors' day. It was distributed twice daily, at noon and in the early evening, and it consisted of a measured amount of rum mixed with water, usually in a ratio of 1 part rum to 2 or 3 parts water. The officer of the watch oversaw the distribution, standing by while the cook's mate ladled out each portion, ensuring that no one received more than his allotment and no one was missed. The rum was, for many sailors, the highlight of the day. Not because they were necessarily heavy drinkers in any simple sense, but because the rum was warm and sweet, and it spread through the body in a way that the cold, salty food did not. On a cold night at sea, a sailor who had just come off watch and received his grog ration would drink it slowly, standing in the lee of something that cut the wind, and feel, at least for a few minutes, genuinely comfortable. Grog gave rise to an entire vocabulary. The quality of the rum, the temperature of the water it was mixed with, the exact ratio of dilution, these were subjects of constant discussion and mild complaint. Men who had strong opinions about their grog were exercising one of the few areas of consumer preference available to them, and they exercised it with feeling. After the evening meal, there was the brief, loose, unstructured time before dark. This was the hour that many sailors seemed to have valued most, or at least remembered most warmly. The work was done for the evening, the meal was eaten, the grog had been distributed, the watch had been set, and for an hour or two, the men who were not on duty sat about the deck or below and were, in a sense, free. What they did with this freedom was various and interesting. Some smoked pipes. Tobacco was a constant presence on sailing ships from the moment it arrived in Europe from the Americas in the late 16th century, and the sailors of the Age of Sail were enthusiastic consumers of it. A pipe of tobacco in the evening, sitting on a coil of rope in the stern or leaning on the rail watching the wake, was one of the small pleasures that could be genuinely looked forward to through a day of hard work. The smell of pipe tobacco, sweet and woody and slightly astringent, mixed with the salt air, and the small coal of light at the bowl glowed and faded and glowed again. There were strict rules about where smoking could take place on a ship. The risk of fire at sea was existential, and the rules about fire management were among the most seriously enforced on board. Smoking was usually confined to designated areas, the bow typically in the sandbox or on the waterway where sparks could be controlled, and violations were treated harshly. But within these rules, the pipe was allowed and expected. Some told stories. This is a practice so old that it predates writing, and the sailors of the Age of Sail were its faithful inheritors. In the evenings, when the light was going and the men were sitting about at ease, someone would start talking. Not usually in any formal way, there was no designated storyteller, no audience assembled. It was more organic than that. Someone would begin describing something they had seen on a previous voyage, and others would listen, and others would add things, and the story would grow and change and acquire details that may or may not have been true in any strict sense, but were always true in the way that a good story is true. The stories sailors told were of a particular character. They were about other ships, other voyages, other storms. They were about ports they had visited, the specific, personal geography of a sailor's life, which was nothing like the geography of a landsman. A sailor's map of the world was made of harbors and anchorages, of particular taverns and particular women, of the quality of water in this port and the cost of provisions in that one. It was a practical geography, detailed and specific, built out of direct experience. There were also the other stories, the ones that are harder to categorize. Sailors were, by reputation, and I think by genuine temperament, a superstitious people. The sea encourages superstition in the way that any environment of genuine uncertainty does. When the outcome of what you are doing is genuinely unpredictable, when the weather can kill you, when the navigation might be wrong, when the ship might spring a leak, then the mind reaches for frameworks of meaning, for ways of understanding why things happen, for systems of cause and effect that extend beyond the purely mechanical. And so the stories in the evening included the other kind, the stories about lights seen off certain capes that no living ship could account for. The stories about the Flying Dutchman, that most persistent of all maritime ghost stories, the spectral vessel condemned to sail forever off the Cape of Good Hope, seen always in bad weather or on the eve of disaster. The stories about sea creatures, about parts of the ocean that were better avoided, about the particular quality of bad luck that attached to certain ships or certain voyages. These stories were told with a mixture of belief and disbelief that was itself very human. Nobody in the group entirely believed all of it. Nobody entirely disbelieved all of it. It existed in the same space as a great many human beliefs about the nature of things, held loosely, revisited when the evidence seemed to point that way, set aside when the morning came and the rational business of navigation resumed. In the evening, with the dark coming on and the sea moving underneath and the stars beginning to show, the stories felt truer. The middle of the night, the watch below and the watch above, and as the night deepens, let us split our attention. On deck, the first watch has been at its work for some hours now. The officer of the watch, a lieutenant on a naval vessel standing in the waist of the ship or pacing the quarterdeck, has settled into the rhythm of his duty. He checks the compass. He observes the sails. He listens to the sea. He speaks to the helmsman at intervals, brief professional exchanges. Are you holding the course? Yes, sir. What speed do you judge? He glances at the log, the chip log, if this is an earlier century, that remarkable piece of low technology, a triangular piece of wood thrown over the stern on a knotted line, the knots counted as they run through a man's hands in a measured time, giving a speed in knots, a measurement still used in our own time. In later periods, taffrail log, a small propeller on a long line, its revolutions counted by a dial, serves the same purpose more accurately. He does his calculations. He marks the slate. The watch goes on. The night is different at different times of the year in different latitudes. A night watch in the tropics, where the air is warm and the stars are brilliant and the sea is calm and dark, and the bioluminescence in the bow wave makes it look as though the ship is cutting through liquid light. That is one kind of night. A night watch in the North Atlantic in October, when the wind is cold and the seas are long and gray-green, and the spray comes back over the bow and soaks whatever it touches, and the ship rolls in a way that makes everything below crash and swing. That is another kind entirely. The watch above has to endure whatever the night brings, wearing whatever wet or wind protection they have, moving around the deck to maintain circulation, talking very little because the wind makes conversation difficult. Below in the forecastle, the off-watch men are sleeping. They are not all asleep, necessarily, not immediately. For the first hour after coming below, there's usually some low conversation, some movement, someone doing small repairs to clothing by lamplight, someone eating something saved from the evening meal. But gradually the forecastle quiets, the lamp burns low, and one by one the hammocks stop their gentle swaying against the motion, and the breathing deepens and the men sleep. The hammock, once you were accustomed to it, was generally considered comfortable by the sailors who used it. The objections to hammocks are usually theoretical, the idea that lying in a curved surface with your legs slightly elevated would be uncomfortable. In practice, it seems that the hammock's tendency to hold the sleeper in place, preventing the rolling and sliding that would otherwise happen on a moving ship, was more than enough compensation for any theoretical discomfort. Men who had slept in hammocks for years, and who were given the chance to sleep in a fixed bed at sea, often found the fixed bed worse. The hammock moved with the ship. That was the thing. When the ship rolled, that slow, deep side-to-side motion of a vessel in a beam swell, a hammock hung from a fixed point overhead would remain roughly upright by gravity while the ship moved under it, and the effect on the sleeper was a compensating motion, like being rocked rather than rolled. This was, it seems, profoundly conducive to sleep. Many sailors described arriving at port and having difficulty sleeping in a still bed on land, their bodies having entirely adapted to the continuous gentle motion of the sea. In the hammock in the dark forecastle, the sailor's sleeping position was characteristic. The hammock held him on his back or very slightly on his side. His knees were perhaps slightly bent. His arms were folded across his chest or lying at his sides inside the canvas. He had a blanket. His hammock blankets, which were part of his issued kit on naval vessels, were also the material with which the hammock was stuffed into its netting bag when not in use. He was warm, or at least warmer than on deck. The sounds of the ship were all around him, closer now, more intimate. The water sounds very near, the creak of the timbers in his ear. He slept the sleep of the genuinely tired. Not the restless sleep of someone who has spent the day doing things that tax them mentally but not physically. The sleep of a man whose body has worked, whose shoulders ache from handling the braces, whose hands are roughened from rope, whose calves are tight from standing on a moving deck for 4 hours. Physical tiredness of this specific kind produces a sleep that many people, particularly those who live sedentary modern lives, have almost never experienced. It is a sleep with very little space between lying down and losing consciousness. It is not a falling into sleep. It is more of a stepping, a single deliberate motion. 3 hours pass. The bell has been striking all this time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 bells of the first watch, which means 11 o'clock in the evening. 7 bells, and then 8 bells midnight, and the watch changes. The change of the watch is one of the distinctive rituals of shipboard life. The incoming watch assembles on deck before midnight, giving the outgoing watch a moment to complete any final tasks and hand over the ship in an orderly way. The officer of the incoming watch comes to the quarterdeck and receives the watch report from the officer he is relieving. The course, the speed, any notable occurrences during the past 4 hours, the state of the weather, any orders from the captain that are still in effect. This exchange is brief and professional. The binnacle light illuminates the compass and the two men's faces from below, giving them that slightly orange, slightly shadowy look that all candlelight gives. Then the outgoing watch goes below, and the middle watch, the hardest, darkest watch of the night, begins. Below in the forecastle, a new group of men is now sleeping. The men who were on the first watch have come below. They made their way down the hatch, navigating the dark forecastle by memory, finding their hammocks without needing to see them, climbing in with practiced ease. The quiet of the forecastle absorbs them. The men who will be roused for the middle watch are sleeping as deeply as their approximately 4 hours will allow. The middle watch sleepers are, in a sense, holding a kind of reserve. They will be needed in a few hours. They know this and they sleep accordingly, not worrying about it, because worrying is a waste of sleep and sailors are too practical for it, but sleeping with an awareness somewhere in the back of their minds that keeps their sleep from being perfectly deep. They will come awake quickly when called. They always do. The man who comes to wake them, the boatswain's mate, usually, or the petty officer of the watch, comes below with no ceremony. He does not call out generally. He finds the specific hammocks that contain the specific men who are needed, and he shakes each one, or calls the name, and the man wakes. The waking from the middle watch call was described by many sailors as the most difficult moment of the whole experience of being at sea. To be dragged from a deep, warm sleep at midnight, with 3 more hours of darkness ahead and the sound of the wind suggesting it was cold out there, to have to leave the canvas warmth of the hammock and pull on whatever damp outer garments were available, to climb up the ladder and feel the cold salt air hit the face and the deck heave under the feet, this required a particular quality of will. Sailors developed it because they had to. They became, after a few voyages, the sort of people who could transition from deep sleep to full wakefulness in the time it took to climb out of a hammock, with no intermediate period of groggy confusion. This transition happened in a matter of seconds, not minutes. The body learned it. The nervous system adapted. On deck, the middle watch settles into its duty. This is the time of night that is, objectively, the darkest, not only in terms of the position of the sun below the horizon, but psychologically. The brain's circadian rhythms, if we are using modern language for an ancient experience, are at their lowest ebb somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning. The body temperature is at its minimum. The mind moves more slowly. The world seems further away and less real than it does at any other hour. This is the hour when strange things seem possible at sea, and when the cold is most penetrating, and when the ocean seems most enormous. It is also, under certain conditions, extraordinarily beautiful. A clear night at sea, halfway between sunset and sunrise, is one of the more remarkable visual experiences available to a human being. The stars, without any competing light source, are brilliant in a way that is genuinely difficult to convey to someone who has only seen them from land. They are not points of light against a dark sky. They are a texture, almost a substance, a river of light in the band of the Milky Way, with individual stars of varying brightness and color scattered across everything, so many of them that the pattern of the constellations that you learned from books is actually harder to find, not easier, because there are so many more stars filling in around them than you expected. The sea in this light has a particular quality. The wave crests broken by the wind are slightly luminous, white foam in the starlight, or sometimes the green-blue fire of bioluminescence, where microscopic organisms in the water react to disturbance by emitting their brief, cold light. The wake of the ship, particularly in tropical waters, could be an extraordinary sight. A long, pale, faintly glowing road stretching back into the darkness, marked with the tumbling blue-white fire of disturbed bioluminescence, narrow at first behind the stern and then spreading out as the water calmed, until it vanished into the general darkness 100 yards back. The man at the helm watches the stars as much as the compass. He picks a star near the course he is to steer and keeps it in the same position relative to the mast or the stay, and he steers by it. This was standard practice in clear weather, and it connected the sailor directly to the most ancient navigation. There was the navigation of people crossing deserts and oceans by the pattern of lights overhead, the navigation that was old before written records began. Meanwhile, in another quiet corner of history, let us step away from the deck and spend some time in a place most accounts ignore. The ship's surgeon and the sick berth. Not all nights at sea were pleasant for all those who spent them, and we should be honest about this, without dwelling on it more than honesty requires. The sick berth was a designated space on a naval vessel for those men who were ill or injured. On a well-appointed ship, it might be a separate compartment, away from the forecastle, where sick men could be separated from the general population. On smaller ships or in earlier centuries, it might simply be a section of the lower deck where hammocks were hung a little lower and a little further from the cold outer hull. The ship's surgeon had his own particular relationship with the night. In the Royal Navy of the 18th century, the surgeon was a warrant officer, not a commissioned officer, but a professional man with a recognized status somewhat above that of the ordinary seaman and somewhat below that of the lieutenants. He was required to have had formal medical training, to have passed examinations set by the Company of Surgeons, or later, the Royal College of Surgeons, and to be capable of performing the procedures that sea service demanded, setting broken limbs, treating the wounds of battle, amputating when necessary, managing the various ailments that afflicted men living in close quarters on inadequate food in variable climates. On a routine voyage with no battle and no particular epidemic, the surgeon's nights were relatively quiet. He made his evening rounds of the sick berth, a brief visit to each sick man, feeling the pulse, observing the breathing, asking a few questions in the quiet, non-committal voice that experienced doctors learn to use, the voice that does not betray anxiety even when there is reason for it. He updated his journal because surgeons were required to keep detailed medical logs, recording each patient's symptoms, treatment, and progress. This journal, more than almost any other document from the period, gives us intimate access to the daily health reality of life at sea. The sick berth at night was, under most circumstances, a place of quiet misery rather than acute crisis. Men with fevers lay sweating in their hammocks. Men with the ever-present curse of scurvy, the vitamin C deficiency that was the great endemic disease of long sea voyages, robbing men of their strength and eventually their lives if not treated, lay weakly in their hammocks, their gums tender, their joints aching, too fatigued to do much more than breathe. Men recovering from injuries from the work of the ship, falls from aloft, ropes running through hands too quickly, barked shins and sprained ankles, and the dozens of small violences that a wooden ship inflicted on its crew, rested and healed. The surgeon sat in the sick berth in the evening and listened to the breathing of his patients and the sounds of the ship around them, and he thought his thoughts. The job of a ship's surgeon was, in many cases, a lonely one. He was isolated from both the world of the officers and the world of the common sailors. He had his professional role, and within that role he was respected, or at least consulted. But outside it, he was something between the two social worlds on the ship, belonging entirely to neither. Some surgeons were deeply engaged men, endlessly curious about the medical questions their environment presented. The diseases of the sea, scurvy, dysentery, yellow fever in the tropics, typhus in close quarters, the various fevers that defied contemporary understanding, were genuine medical mysteries, and a thoughtful surgeon at sea was in a position to observe them with a consistency and attention that no shore-based physician could match. Some of the foundational work of maritime medicine came from exactly this kind of careful observation, night after night, by men sitting in the dim light of the sick berth, watching their patients and writing things down. James Lind, the Scottish naval surgeon who conducted what is often called the first controlled clinical trial in the history of medicine, testing the effect of citrus juice on scurvy among sailors in 1747, was exactly this kind of man. He was present on the ship. He saw the same men every day, monitored their progress, compared their outcomes. The setting that produced this work was the ordinary routine of a ship's surgeon, the daily rounds, the evening notes, the long nights in the sick berth with the sounds of the ship for company. But let us not stay too long in the sick berth. The men here will rest as they are able, and the surgeon will look in on them again before morning, and for most of them, on a good voyage, without epidemic or battle, the outcome will be recovery. Let us go back to the ordinary night, the quiet night, the night of most voyages. ONTHE watch, the long quiet HOURS, there is a specific quality to the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning on a ship at sea. If you were on the middle watch, if you were one of the men standing on the cold deck, doing your duty in the darkness, there came a point, usually somewhere around the 3rd hour, when the initial cold discomfort had settled into a sort of acceptance. The body had adjusted its circulation to keep itself warm enough. The feet, which had been cold, were now less cold. The hands, tucked into coat pockets or wrapped around a mug of something warm if the cook had been willing to keep something going, were functioning. And in this state of cold, quiet, partial acceptance, the mind did its interesting work. Men on night watch thought about things they did not think about at other times. The displacement from ordinary life that sea service created, the removal from family and community, the suspension of all the ordinary social obligations and structures that organized a life on land, gave the mind a particular kind of space. There was nothing to do in this darkness except watch and listen and think, and the thoughts that came in these hours were sometimes the thoughts that had been waiting for space all day. Men thought about home. This is so constant in the accounts of sailors, from all periods and all nationalities, that it amounts to almost a law. The long night watches produced homesickness, not necessarily in the acute, painful form, but in a steady, low-level form that became simply part of the texture of the watch. You thought about the house you came from, the people in it, what they were doing now, which was sleeping, probably, since it was the middle of the night. You thought about small, specific things. The smell of a particular kitchen, the sound of a particular voice, the way light fell into a particular room at a particular time of day. These thoughts were not necessarily painful. They were more like a slow, persistent conversation with an absent world. The sailor allowed them, turned them over, and continued his watch. Men also thought about the sea itself. There is something about being on the water at night, particularly in the middle watch, when the ship is moving through absolute darkness and the ocean extends away in every direction, and below you there are hundreds or thousands of feet of water, and you are standing on a construction of wood and rope that is, in the cosmic scale, absurdly small. There is something about this that produces a particular quality of thought, a quality of scale, of smallness. Not in a frightening way necessarily, but in a clarifying way. The sea at night stripped away a certain amount of the noise that ordinary life generated, and what remained was something quieter and more essential. Many sailors, writing about these hours, described something that was not quite religious experience and not quite philosophical reflection and not quite simple animal awareness, but something that drew on all three, an attention to being alive. A quiet recognition of the extraordinary specificity of one moment, this watch, this night, this sea, these stars. The officer paced the quarterdeck. Pacing was the traditional activity of the officer of the watch, and it served multiple purposes. It kept him warm, it kept him awake, it kept him moving and therefore alert, and it placed him visibly as a constant presence on the deck, a reassurance to the helmsman and the lookout that authority was present and attentive. Quarterdeck was the raised section of deck at the stern of the ship, above the captain's cabin, and it was the operational center of the vessel. The helm was here, and the binnacle with its compass, and the pinnacle lamp that cast a small circle of light in the darkness. The officer walked from the lee rail to the weather rail and back again, perhaps 10 or 12 steps each way, his coat buttoned against the wind, his hat pulled down against the motion of the ship. From the quarterdeck, he could see the whole ship. Forward, the dim shapes of the sails against the sky. The mainmast rising into the darkness with its several yards of canvas spread against the wind, the pale rectangles of the topsails just visible above. The white water along the bows where the ship pressed through the sea. The lookout at the bow, a dark shape against the lighter darkness of the sky. On either side the sea, the steady movement of the waves. Above, the stars. This was his world for 4 hours, twice in every 24-hour period. He knew it so well that he could have drawn it in the dark, the exact position of every rope end, every cleat, every marking on the compass. He had stood this watch in every weather that the sea produced. He knew the sound of the ship in a following wind versus the sound in a cross sea. He knew the feeling of the deck underfoot in a swell versus in short, steep waves. He had accumulated a library of sensory knowledge that was entirely specific to this ship, this sea, this life. He was not in the small hours of the morning particularly aware of this knowledge. It was simply what he knew, the way a person who has lived in one house for 30 years does not think about knowing where the light switches are. It was there, accessible, ready to be used. He walked and watched, and the ship moved through the darkness and the night went on. Meanwhile, in the forecastle, the first watch was sleeping, and some of them were dreaming. We cannot know what sailors dreamed. No one recorded their dreams in any systematic way, and dreams in any case have the inconvenient quality of mostly disappearing on waking, leaving only a residue of feeling. But we can make some educated guesses based on what we know about dreams in general and about the specific psychological conditions of sea service. Dreams are strongly influenced by the sensory environment in which the dreamer is sleeping. A person sleeping in a hammock on a moving ship, surrounded by the sounds of wood and water and wind, would be processing these sensations into the fabric of their dreams in the way all dreamers process their environments. The sounds that are present in sleep are incorporated, distorted, given story. The motion that is always there becomes the motion of dream landscapes. The cold that intrudes from the hull becomes the cold of dream settings. Dreams are also influenced by what the dreamer experienced and thought about during the day, and the life of a sailor provided very specific material. The sea itself, its particular visual quality, its particular sound, its scale, would have been, for many sailors, a presence in their dreams in a way that the sea is rarely a presence in the dreams of people who live at a distance from it. Land appeared in sailors' dreams. This was remarked upon by sailors themselves, and by the physicians and officers who spent time with them. After long periods at sea, the dreaming mind returned repeatedly to the things that were absent: grass, trees, solid ground, the faces of people from home. There was something in these dreams that seemed to be the mind's way of maintaining a connection to the half of life that the sea temporarily erased, of keeping alive an interior landscape that matched the exterior landscape of memory. The sailor in his hammock turned slightly in his sleep, and the hammock's motion smoothed the turning, and he went deeper. and the bell struck 6 times now, the middle of the middle watch, and he did not hear it. The small stories individual lives in the night history is large scale and small scale simultaneously, and the large scale version, the dates, the battles, the names of captains and their ships, is much easier to recover from the past than the small scale version. But the small scale version is what we are here for. So let us look at a few specific men, in specific times, in specific ships, and think about their particular nights. Consider the English merchant sailor in the early 1700s, on a vessel crossing from Bristol to the West Indies and back. This is a man with a specific, knowable life. We can reconstruct its outlines from the records and accounts that survive. He was probably somewhere between 20 and 40 years old. The sea was a young man's profession, though it aged people quickly. He had probably been at sea for some years already. He spoke English with a regional accent that placed him in the West Country or possibly South Wales, because that is where Bristol sailors generally came from. He had calluses on his hands and a particular redness on the backs of his neck, and hands where the sun had permanently altered the skin. His ship was a merchant vessel of perhaps 200 tons, a substantial ship, not enormous, square-rigged on the main and foremast with a lateen sail on the small mizzenmast at the stern. The crew was small by naval standards. Merchant ships ran with as few men as they could manage, because sailors' wages were a major expense, and fewer sailors meant more profit. So this ship, carrying perhaps 200 tons of sugar or tobacco on the homeward leg, was crewed by perhaps 15 men, 2 of them officers, the rest ordinary seamen. 15 men, 2 watches of 7 or 8. This was a much smaller, more intimate world than the warship we have been imagining. In the evenings, the cook on this ship produced something from whatever stores were available. The rations on a merchant ship were not subject to the Royal Navy's formal schedule of provisions. They were purchased by the ship's owner, managed by the captain, and the quality and quantity varied considerably depending on the honesty and generosity of the person who had bought them. There were merchants whose ships were well provisioned, and merchants whose ships were not, and the sailors who worked for the latter quickly learned to tell the difference from experience and to ask around before signing on. Our sailor had his supper, salt meat and hard biscuit, as almost always, with perhaps some dried fruit if the voyage was going well, or nothing but biscuit if things were tight. He had his grog ration measured carefully, because on a merchant ship the spirits were valuable and carefully controlled. He sat in the warm evening air. It was summer, and they were in the tropics now, heading home, and smoked his pipe and talked with the men he had sailed with for 3 months. These were not strangers to him. After 3 months at sea together, the men of a small ship were known to each other with a thoroughness that was unusual in ordinary life. You had seen each other in every condition. You had worked alongside each other in bad weather and good, when tempers were short and when they were not, when the ship was easy and when it was difficult. You had slept in the same space, eaten the same food, breathed the same air. This kind of shared experience either produced genuine attachment or genuine antipathy, and on a ship where the crew was only 15, both were acutely felt. Our sailor was attached to a few of these men, perhaps 2 or 3, in the specific way that men form bonds at sea, not particularly expressive bonds, not bonds that required a great deal of talking about, but bonds that operated as a kind of ongoing practical loyalty. These were the men whose watch he shared, whose mess he ate with, who would pull him out of the sea if something went wrong, and he would do the same for them. He went below at the change of the watch and found his hammock. The tropical heat meant it was warm below, almost uncomfortably so, but the sea air that came through the open hatch provided some circulation. He lay in the canvas, listening to the sounds of the ship. The water sounded different here than it had in the gray North Atlantic. It was warmer sounding, if that makes sense. The slapping of the hull was lighter, higher in pitch, the sea itself having a different quality in these latitudes. He could hear flying fish leaping from time to time off the bow, a small, rapid flapping, then silence. Occasionally something larger broke the surface alongside, and there was a louder splash. He slept. Now let us move forward in time. It is the 1790s. We are aboard a Royal Navy frigate somewhere in the Mediterranean. The ship is on patrol, a cruising voyage, looking for French privateers and enemy merchant vessels. It has been at sea for 3 weeks and has touched port twice briefly. The crew is 65 men, which is small even for a frigate of this size. Among these men is a midshipman. He is 15 years old. The midshipman's place in the hierarchy of a naval ship was peculiar. He was an officer in training, junior to the lieutenants but above the common sailors, and his life was lived in a state of perpetual in-between. He messed with the other midshipmen in the midshipman's berth, which was a small, cramped space below the gun deck, dark and low-ceilinged, furnished with a table and hammocks slung so close together that climbing into one required care. It was not a comfortable space for a 15-year-old boy. He had been at sea for 8 months. He had been homesick for most of those 8 months in varying degrees. He had learned things about the sea and the ship that he had never expected to learn, and some of them were wonderful and some of them were miserable. He had been sick in bad weather, not once but repeatedly, with the particular misery of motion sickness that is so deeply unpleasant when it is happening, and that leaves almost no trace when it stops. He had been cold in the night watch and hot in the tropics, and sometimes both within the same week when the ship moved through weather systems. He had been frightened on the one occasion when they had engaged a French privateer, an action that lasted 45 minutes and resulted in 2 of his shipmates being injured and his own coat being cut by a piece of flying timber. But he was still here. He had not left when the ship touched port. He was still a midshipman, still standing his watches, still learning. On this particular night, the Mediterranean was calm. The sea had that particular quality that the Mediterranean sometimes has in summer, that deep, dark blue that seemed almost too deep, too blue, as if it were a different substance from the North Atlantic gray. The air was warm and smelled of something floral, very faint, perhaps carried from the shore that was somewhere over the horizon. He was on the morning watch. He would not be needed until 4 in the morning, which meant he had been asleep in his hammock since midnight, and he had perhaps 6 hours of sleep coming an unusual luxury, because the watch system meant that sometimes the timing was generous. He was asleep. He was deeply asleep in the way that 15-year-olds sleep when they are genuinely tired, which he always was. Above him, the night watch continued. The officer of the watch paced his quarterdeck. The helmsman held his course. The lookout watched, the boys slept, and the sea moved beneath the ship, and the stars crossed their slow arc overhead. Let us find one more person before we move on. It is 1812. The War of 1812 is being fought between the United States and Britain, and we are on an American privateer, a private ship licensed by the U.S. government to attack British merchant vessels. The privateer is a fast schooner, not large, carrying 16 guns and a crew of around 60 men. She is fast, which is her primary virtue, and she has been moderately successful, having taken 2 prizes in the past month and sent them into port under prize crews. The crew of the privateer was different from the crew of a Royal Navy vessel in ways that mattered to the people living that life. The men had signed on voluntarily, knowing approximately what they were getting into, attracted by the prospect of prize money. This was not a press-ganged crew. It was a crew of men who had chosen to be there, which gave the atmosphere on board a somewhat different quality from the involuntary service that was the reality for many sailors in the Royal Navy of the same era. The privateer's night routine was also somewhat different because the nature of the work was different. A privateer was always watching, not just for hazards, but for potential prizes. Every sail on the horizon was potentially interesting. The watch was kept with a quality of alert attention that was more than ordinarily acute, because missing a potential prize meant missing money, and money was why they were there. But at 3 in the morning, with the ship lying hove to, that is, with the sails backed against each other, so that the ship more or less stood still in the water, waiting for dawn before resuming operations, the watch on deck was quiet. The captain, a man in his mid-30s who had been a merchant captain before the war and who had converted his commercial vessel and his commercial skills to this new purpose with some success, was asleep in his cabin. In the cabin, he lay on his narrow bunk, and outside his stern windows the dark Atlantic moved, and the ship rocked very gently in the hove to position, and somewhere above him the watch kept their quiet vigil. He was a man who had been at sea since he was 12. He had slept in more ships' cabins, more forecastles, more ships' berths than he could easily count. The sea at night was something so familiar to him that it no longer registered as remarkable. But sometimes, in the way that the very familiar can suddenly become unfamiliar again for a moment, can reassert its essential strangeness, sometimes he would lie in his bunk and listen to the water outside the hull, so close, so present, and feel the uncomplicated amazement of it. Just the water and the wood and the darkness and the depth below. He slept. In the morning there might be a sail on the horizon, or there might not. The sea would tell him when it had something to say. The tools of the night, navigation in the dark, and as the night deepens further, let us think about how ships found their way. Navigation at night was one of the central technical challenges of the age of sail, and the solutions that sailors developed for it were a mixture of the precise, the approximate, and the deeply intuitive. The most important tool was the compass. The magnetic compass had been known in Europe since at least the 12th century, though it is considerably older in Chinese history. By the time we are interested in the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries, the compass was a mature instrument, understood, trusted, and never absent from a navigating vessel. It sat in its binnacle, a wooden box with a lamp to illuminate it at night, just forward of the helm, and the helmsman looked at it constantly. The compass card, painted with the 32 points of the compass, moved as the ship moved, always aligning with magnetic north, and the helmsman kept his course by keeping the ordered heading under the lubber's line. The compass was not perfect. Magnetic north is not true north. The angle between them, called magnetic variation, changes from place to place on the Earth's surface. A navigator going from, say, the east coast of England toward the west coast of France needed to know the variation for those waters and apply a correction to his compass reading. This was known, recorded in the rudders and pilot books that navigators used and applied, but it required knowledge and attention. There was also the problem of deviation, the effect of the ship's own iron and steel on the compass needle. On wooden ships of the earlier age, this was less significant because there was less metal. As ships incorporated more iron, the great iron-hulled steamships of the 19th century being the extreme case, deviation became a significant issue, requiring compensation and correction. At night, the compass was supplemented by the stars. Celestial navigation, determining a ship's position by the angle of celestial bodies above the horizon, was the fundamental positioning system of the Age of Sail, and its nighttime application was as important as its daytime one. The North Star, Polaris, sits almost directly above the North Pole, and its height above the horizon equals the observer's latitude in the Northern Hemisphere. This is a fact of such elementary and practical importance that it had been known and used by northern sailors since before recorded history. A sailor in 1200 or 1400 or 1700 in the Northern Hemisphere who could see Polaris knew his latitude. The instrument for measuring this height was the sextant, or its predecessors, the quadrant and the astrolabe. The sextant, which became standard in its modern form in the 18th century, was an optical instrument that allowed the navigator to measure the angle between a celestial body and the horizon with considerable precision. By combining multiple such measurements at known times, the position of the ship could be calculated, but sextant work at night on a moving ship required skill. The navigator stood on the deck, one hand steadying himself against the motion of the ship, the other holding the sextant. He looked through the eyepiece and found the star he wanted. He moved the index arm of the sextant until the reflected image of the star touched the horizon being visible at night as a dark line dividing the slightly lighter sky from the slightly darker sea. He noted the angle. He noted the time from the chronometer, which was kept in the captain's cabin in a padded box, its mechanism ticking steadily, its time representing Greenwich time and therefore the basis for calculating longitude. This operation, performed in darkness on a moving deck, often in cold and wind, was a technical accomplishment that combined mathematical knowledge with physical skill in a way that a landsman would find difficult to fully appreciate. The navigator knew what the star's position should be at a given time if the ship were where he thought it was. He compared his measurement with his expectation. If they matched, good. If they did not match, he worked through his calculation again, looking for the error, which might be in the measurement, might be in the calculation, might be in the ship's actual position. Longitude remained the harder problem. Knowing your latitude was relatively straightforward, with clear skies and a good instrument. Knowing your longitude required knowing the exact time at a known reference meridian, Greenwich, by international convention, and comparing it to the local time indicated by the sun's or star's position. The chronometer provided this reference, but it had to be accurate, and it had to be maintained, and in the earlier periods of our story, before accurate chronometers were widely available, longitude was determined by dead reckoning, estimating position based on known starting point, course steered, and distance traveled. Dead reckoning was the navigator's art in its most human form. It required knowing the ship's speed, measured by the log, and the ship's course, measured by the compass, and the time elapsed, and then calculating the resulting displacement from the last known position. This was not difficult mathematics, but it accumulated errors. Every small error in the speed estimate, every small error in the course, every current that the navigator had not accounted for, every deviation in the compass, all of these errors added up over the days and weeks of a voyage, and the position that dead reckoning produced was always somewhat uncertain. Experienced navigators developed a feel for this uncertainty. They worked with ranges of probable position rather than precise points. They knew that after 2 weeks of dead reckoning across the Atlantic, they might be 20 miles off, or 50, or in adverse conditions more. They planned for this. They approached coasts cautiously, taking soundings with the lead to measure depth and compare the bottom with the chart, using every available piece of information to refine their estimate of where they actually were. At night, approaching an unknown coast, the lead line was everything. The leadsman stood at the bow and threw his lead, a weight of about 14 pounds on a marked line forward, and let it fall to the bottom as the ship passed over the point where it had landed, measuring the depth. The marks on the line told the depth. The nature of the sample brought up on the tallow-coated bottom of the lead, sand, mud, gravel, shells, told something about the character of the seafloor. An experienced pilot could identify his position on a coast from depth and bottom type alone, in darkness, without seeing anything. The cry of the leadsman, by the mark 10, meaning 10 fathoms of depth at the nearest mark, was one of the most anxiously awaited sounds on a ship approaching land at night. It told you where you were in a way that nothing else could in darkness. It told you how much time you had. And as the night deepens toward its final hour, let us step back from these technical matters and find the larger picture again. Chapter 10. The World of the Watch, Philosophy of the Small Hours. There is a passage in one of the letters of a Royal Navy lieutenant, written in 1801, that has always seemed to me to capture something essential about the experience of keeping the night watch at sea. The lieutenant is writing to his brother, and he is trying to explain what the middle watch feels like, and he writes in his own 18th century idiom, which I will translate slightly into more modern language without losing its sense. He says that there is a particular quality of thought that arrives at about 3 a.m. on a still night in the middle of the ocean. He says that on land, he has never had this thought or anything like it. He says that it is not quite a thought in the ordinary sense. It is more like a condition, a state of the mind in which it becomes very clear all at once that the world is enormously large and that he is in it, specifically in this place on this ship at this hour, and that this seems to him in this moment to be enough, more than enough, a sufficiency. He then goes on to describe the stars and the sea in practical terms and comments on the likelihood of wind the next day, and the moment passes. But that moment is worth dwelling on. The physical conditions of the night watch, the cold, the darkness, the limited social interaction, the steady requirement of attention, seem to have been productive of a particular kind of reflective awareness in at least some of the men who experienced it. This is not surprising in retrospect. Solitude and the requirement of attention are conditions that many contemplative traditions across many cultures have deliberately sought to create. The night watch created them by circumstance. Not all sailors experienced the night watch as philosophically generous. Many experienced it primarily as cold and tedious. But the ones who left accounts of it often described something that was not merely tedium, a quality of presence, a kind of quiet that was different from the quiet of a room, a darkness that was different from the darkness with which they were familiar on land. This was the night watch. And after 4 hours of it, the bell would strike 8 times, and the watch would change, and the morning would begin to come. The approaching dawn, the morning watch, 4 in the morning until 8, had a character entirely its own. It began in the deepest dark, the same darkness as the end of the middle watch, the same cold, the same stars. But it ended in full daylight, in the working morning of the ship, and the transition between these two states was one of the more dramatic experiences available on the deck of a ship at sea. The sailors of the morning watch knew the dawn was coming, because they could feel it in the way that people who spend time outdoors feel changes before they are visible. There was a slight softening of the darkness, barely perceptible, that came about half an hour before the first actual light appeared. The eastern horizon seemed infinitesimally less dark than it had been, and then slightly less dark again, and you found yourself looking that way more often, waiting. Then the light, it never arrived all at once. It assembled itself in stages. First a long, low bar of gray along the horizon, so faint that it was more a change in texture than a change in brightness. Then a gradual lifting of the gray into the sky, a widening band of less dark that spread upward slowly. The stars in the east began to fade, the brightest ones holding their light the longest before finally yielding to the growing blue of the sky behind them. The sea changed color as the light grew. It went from black to deep blue-gray to gray-green to the first hints of its actual color, whether the deep blue of the tropics, or the gray-green of northern waters, or the particular greenish-brown of shallow coastal seas. The wave crests, which had been white in the darkness, became white in a different, fuller way, and the wave troughs showed their proper color, and the whole seascape assembled itself, piece by piece, out of the dissolving darkness. The men of the morning watch watched this process. And then in the officers' binoculars, or the unaided eyes of the lookout, the horizon became clear and searchable, and whatever the night had placed there, another ship, a headland, a fishing smack going out, a line of gray cloud that might be weather coming, whatever was out there could now be seen. This moment, the moment when the horizon became clear in the morning, was the moment of highest anxiety in certain navigational situations. If you had been approaching a coast through the night, sailing carefully by dead reckoning and soundings, and now the light was coming, and the horizon was separating from the sky, and you were looking east or looking north toward where the coast should be, this was the moment when you would see it if it was there. Experienced navigators and captains often time their approaches to coasts so as to make a landfall in the morning, in exactly this way. You spent the night approaching carefully, measuring depth, keeping good track of your course and speed, and you arranged things so that with the first light of dawn you would look up and see the cliffs or the headland or the lighthouse that told you exactly where you were. There was a particular satisfaction in this that seamen of the age of sail described with a warmth that is easy to feel even from this distance. You had crossed an ocean, or at least a considerable stretch of water, guided by mathematics and experience and judgment, in darkness and uncertainty, and then the light came and there it was, the land where you said it would be, the lighthouse showing its light, the headland with its distinctive outline against the morning sky. This was the navigator's reward, the particular small vindication of having thought correctly about a hard problem, but we are getting ahead of ourselves again. On many voyages, the long blue water voyages from which so much of our story is drawn, there was no land in the morning. There was only more sea, stretching away in every direction, and the morning brought nothing except more of the same and a new day ahead. The morning watch officer noted the time of the first light in his log. He made his observation of the sun as it rose, measuring its height above the horizon with the sextant, noting the time, working the sight when he had a moment, updating the ship's calculated position. He observed the weather and noted it in the log, the direction and force of the wind, the state of the sky, the height and character of the waves. And on the deck below him, as the light improved, the ship began to stir. The cook had been up since 4. The cook was always up before anyone else, because the fire had to be lit and the pot had to be heated, and whatever was serving as breakfast had to be prepared in time for the change of the watch at 8. On a well-provisioned voyage, breakfast might involve something warm: oatmeal or burgoo, which was a kind of thick oatmeal porridge, or dried peas boiled into a thick, not very exciting, but genuinely warm and filling mush. There might be biscuit, there might be cheese. The smell of the cooking fire, coming up from the galley amidships and drifting aft with the wind, was the first clear signal that the day was resuming. The men who were still asleep in the forecastle, those who had come off the middle watch at 4 and had slept until 7 or so, woke to this smell. It mingled with the salt air that came down the hatch, and with the sounds of the morning watch working on deck above, and with the ship's own constant conversation of creaks and groans and water sounds. They woke. The morning waking in the forecastle was a different experience from the night waking. There was light, natural light, coming down the open hatch in the morning, reaching into the dark corners of the space and illuminating things that had been invisible in the night. The hammocks swayed, and men climbed down from them, and the forecastle was briefly full of the shuffling, stretching, quiet conversation of men coming back to the world. Someone would go up for the water, fresh water, for washing, which was a limited resource on a sailing ship and was not always available for the sort of morning wash that people on land took for granted. Some ships had better water management than others. Some captains insisted on a morning wash as a health measure, which it was, and provided the water for it. Others were less particular, but the face and hands were always washed when possible. Even on a ship with limited fresh water, even on a voyage where the provisions were not generous, the morning washing of face and hands was a remnant of humanity that men clung to. It was a signal. The day is beginning. You are a person who begins days in a particular way. Here is the evidence. Storms, the other kind of night we should talk about: storms. Not because this is a story about drama, but because to speak of nights at sea without acknowledging what some of those nights contained would be dishonest. And also because there is something in the description of a storm at night, told slowly, from the inside of the experience, that is illuminating in ways that a calm night is not. A storm did not usually arrive without warning. The sky gave signs. The glass, the barometer, which became standard navigational equipment in the 18th century, fell as low pressure approached. The clouds built on the horizon in distinctive ways, the high cirrus giving way to lower, darker masses. The sea changed its character, becoming longer and more regular in its swells, as if it had already received the news that the wind was coming and was beginning to arrange itself accordingly. Experienced sailors read all of these signs. They spent the later afternoon of a day that would produce a bad night assessing the evidence and consulting among themselves, and looking at the barometer and watching the sky. The captain, if he had any reason to be concerned, would be on deck before the end of the afternoon watch, looking at the same evidence and making his own assessment. The question was always, how bad and how soon? If the conclusion was that weather was coming and coming soon, there was work to do before dark. The ship was prepared for the storm while there was still light to see what you were doing. The lighter sails were taken in, the topgallants and royals. The small sails at the top of the masts that were wonderful in a light breeze and dangerous in a heavy one were furled and secured. The heavier sails were reduced, the topsails might be reefed, which meant a portion of their area was gathered up and tied to the yard, reducing the sail's effective area and therefore the force of the wind upon it. Everything on deck was secured. Anything that could move was either put below or tied down. The cook's fire was extinguished and the galley secured. The guns on a warship were lashed back from their ports and the port lids closed and secured. The ship was, in a manner of speaking, buttoned up. Then the night came and the storm with it. A storm at night at sea was a specific kind of experience, and the specific kind depended on the storm. A gale, a strong, steady wind, force 8 or 9 on what we now call the Beaufort scale, produced a night of sustained noise and motion. The wind in the rigging moved from a singing to a roaring. The seas built over the course of hours into long, dark mountains of water that lifted the ship to their crests and dropped it into their troughs with a motion that was entirely overwhelming to the human body's sense of balance. In a trough, the waves on either side blocked the sky. At the crest, the wind hit with full force and the view in every direction was of moving water. Down below, in this condition, life was extremely difficult. The hammocks swung. This was, in moderate weather, comfortable. In a gale, it meant that the ship was moving so violently that the hammock's corrective motion was not enough to compensate, and the occupant was thrown against the canvas sides and swung back and thrown again, in a constant, unpredictable, exhausting motion. Sleeping in a hammock during a severe storm was possible only for those too exhausted to do anything else, and even they did not sleep comfortably. Everything below was wet. The water came aboard from above, down the hatches when they had to be opened, through any gap in the deck, through the inadequately sealed ports, through the pumps when they ran backwards. It found its way into the forecastle and the lower berths in the officers' cabins, slowly, persistently, filling the spaces between the timbers and running along the deck and soaking into everything it touched. Men's clothing was wet, their hammocks were wet, their personal belongings, if imperfectly stowed, were wet, and yet there was something in the experience of a storm at sea that sailors, writing about it afterward, often described with something other than pure misery. There was, in the absolute extremity of it, a quality of aliveness that was very specific. The noise alone, the sustained roar of wind and water, the crashing and groaning of the ship, the thudding of the seas against the hull so that the whole structure shook, was so overwhelming that it reduced the mind to a simpler state, a state without room for the ordinary concerns of ordinary life. You were present completely in the storm. Nothing else was possible. The crew worked in this. The watch on deck in a heavy gale was working constantly, adjusting the sails, responding to the helmsman's calls, keeping the ship oriented correctly to the seas, because a ship that got sideways to a very large wave could roll so far as to take water over the side, and in extreme cases be knocked down. This was real, serious work, requiring physical strength and judgment and experience, and it was being done in conditions of total sensory overwhelm, in darkness, on a deck that was both wet and moving. Men went aloft in this. Going aloft in a storm, climbing the ratlins to the yards to take in or adjust a sail, was the most demanding and most dangerous work of the age of sail. The ratlins, those rope ladders that led up the shrouds to the tops and thence higher, were now diagonal rather than vertical because the ship was heeling under the wind. The yards were swinging, the sails were thrashing and thundering. And the man going aloft had to hold on, and climb, and then work on the yard, clinging to it with his feet on the footrope and his belly against the spar, and do with his hands whatever needed to be done with the sail. Men fell. Not often, because experience and skill counted for a great deal, and the men who went aloft were those who had been doing it long enough to know how to hold on and where to place their feet. But sometimes, in the worst weather sometimes, the ones who went aloft knew the risk. They went anyway because the ship needed them to, because the alternative was a ship out of control in a storm, which was more dangerous than any risk from going aloft. This is the particular quality of courage that sea service required. Not the dramatic, single-moment courage of a battle charge, but the steady, practical, repeated courage of going to do a necessary and dangerous task in the dark, on a moving platform, in the middle of a storm. The storm passed. It always passed. That was the thing about storms at sea. However violent, however long, they had an end. The glass began to rise. The wind eased by degrees. The seas, which took longer than the wind to calm because waves are more conservative than wind, gradually decreased. The clouds began to break. And then, sometimes quite suddenly, the sun or the stars would appear, and the world was renewed. The morning after a bad storm was one of the more remarkable experiences of sea service. The air was extraordinarily clean, washed absolutely clear of everything, with a quality of light that seemed almost too sharp. The sea was still running high, but the waves had lost their violence, their crests no longer streaked with white spray but rounded and moving in a long, regular swell. The ship was wet all over and needed a great deal of work, things to be dried and inspected and repaired, lines to be sorted and coiled, the galley to be re-established. But the ship was still there. The ship had come through, and the men who had not slept in 12 or 24 hours, who were wet and tired and hungry, attended to these tasks with something that was not quite good cheer but was in the direction of it. A ship that had come through a storm was a ship that had proved itself. The men who had worked it through were men who had proved something about themselves. And the new morning, with its washed air and its regular swell and its returning light, was a morning that felt genuinely earned. And as the storm subsides and the night begins to yield to dawn, let us return to the ordinary night, the quiet night, the night of most of the voyages. Let us return to the slow, steady turning of the watches and the long hours of the open sea. Music and quiet entertainment, let us spend some time with sound that is made deliberately, not the sound of the sea or the ship, but the sounds that sailors made for themselves in the evenings and in the quieter stretches of the night. Music was present on sailing ships in a way that is easy to underestimate. The formal music of the sea was the working music, the shanties, the hall songs, the rhythmic chanting that organized collective labor. These were functional rather than artistic. They existed to synchronize the efforts of men pulling on a rope or working a capstan or heaving on a pump brake, and they were embedded in the work so thoroughly that you could not really separate the singing from the job. But there was also the informal music, the music of the evening, when the day's work was done and the men were at their ease for an hour or two. Almost every ship seems to have had someone who could play a fiddle. This is one of the constants of maritime accounts across centuries and nationalities, the ship's fiddler, sitting somewhere on the deck in the evening with his instrument across his knee, playing whatever he knew. The fiddle was a practical instrument for sea service, not too large, relatively durable, requiring only a bow and the player's own tuning. It could be played standing or sitting, on a moving deck in wind in the half-dark of a lantern. The music a ship's fiddler played was whatever music was available to him, which meant the music of his culture and class and upbringing, the tunes he had grown up with. On an English ship, this was the English and Irish and Scottish traditional repertoire, reels and jigs and hornpipes, slow airs and dance tunes, songs that everyone knew and could join in when the mood was right. On a Spanish or Portuguese ship, other traditions. On an American ship of the early Republic, a rich mixture of British and Irish traditions, frontier ballads, and the early American popular music that was still forming itself out of these various sources. The dancing was real. Sailors danced, and not in a metaphorical sense. They actually danced, on deck in the evenings when the weather was fair and the captain allowed it. The hornpipe, that quintessentially maritime dance, associated so strongly with sailors that it became a kind of cultural symbol, was a genuine part of shipboard life. Men danced on the deck, and other men watched and clapped, and the fiddle played, and the ship moved beneath them all. This dancing was important for reasons beyond entertainment. The physical movement was exercise, keeping bodies limber that might otherwise stiffen from the cold and the repetitive demands of the work. The communal nature of it was a social mechanism, creating shared pleasure and lightening the atmosphere in ways that individual activities could not. The captains who encouraged dancing on their ships generally found that their crews were healthier and less prone to the psychological deterioration that long voyages without relief could produce. There were also the instruments that individual sailors carried for their own use. The mouth harp, the harmonica's ancestor, a small instrument that fit in a pocket, the penny whistle, small enough to be tucked into a coat, the occasional flute, played in the evenings in someone's hammock in the forecastle, with the lamp low and the music going softly through the dark space. Singing without instruments was common. Sailors knew a great many songs, learned and accumulated over voyages, memorized out of genuine pleasure in the words and the tunes. The songs they sang in the evenings were not always the work songs. They were the other songs, the sentimental songs, the love songs, the comic songs, the drinking songs, songs about women left behind in port, songs about battles, real and imagined. Songs that told stories in the way that ballads always tell stories, with the specific detail and the sudden turn and the resolution that might be happy or might not. In the evenings, singing was often a solo performance, one man who knew a particular song carrying it through from beginning to end while others listened, and at the chorus, if there was a chorus, joining in. This was a form of entertainment that cost nothing, required no equipment, and was available wherever there were people who knew songs and had the time to sing them. The time between supper and the first watch was the richest time for this. The grog had been drunk, the food had been eaten, the work was done. The ship was sailing itself, more or less under the care of the watch, and in this interstitial space, the quiet entertainments of the ship unfolded. Card games were omnipresent. Cards were small, portable, easy to use in cramped conditions, and capable of producing hours of engagement from a very small amount of equipment. Every ship had cards, usually in multiple decks in varying states of wear. The games played were the games of the players' backgrounds and nationalities. For English sailors, primarily cribbage and piquet and all fours and put. For Spanish sailors, ombre and tresillo. For the polyglot crews of merchant ships, a mixture of whatever traditions met in that particular ship. Gambling accompanied the card games, and this was a subject of some controversy in the literature of naval discipline. Gambling could lead to disputes, to debt, to the poisoning of the social atmosphere in a ship, and regulations attempting to limit or prohibit it appeared periodically. The regulations had limited effect. Sailors gambled because they had always gambled, because the sea life created exactly the psychological conditions, uncertainty, controlled risk, the need for something to make time meaningful, in which gambling flourishes. The games were played for small stakes, usually because small stakes were all that most men had, and the losses were manageable. There was also the gambling of stories, the swapping of experiences, where the coin was attention rather than money, who had the most extraordinary story, who had seen the most, survived the most, encountered the most improbable. This was a competition of a particular kind, and it had the advantage of producing the stories themselves as a byproduct, so that everyone in the group left with new material. The body, etc., rest, health, and the long voyage. Let us think for a while about the body. The body of a sailor in the age of sail was shaped by the work in ways that are difficult to convey in purely abstract terms. It was not the shaped body of deliberate exercise, of a person going to a gymnasium. It was the shaped body of specific, repetitive, external demands. The shoulders were strong in a particular way, the forward pulling, overhead reaching strength of rope handling. The hands were calloused and strong in the gripping and twisting way that line work required. The feet and ankles were adapted to the moving platform of the deck. The unconscious, constantly active balance that sailors maintained on a moving ship was a continuous micro-exercise that built specific stability. This body needed rest, and it got rest in the specific, interrupted way that the watch system allowed. 4 hours on, 4 hours off, so that in a 24-hour day, the sailor slept in 2 blocks of 4 hours each, 8 hours total. This is, by the standards of modern sleep science, not a particularly bad allocation. 8 hours is often cited as the human ideal. But the interruption of sleep into 2 blocks, the necessity of being fully functional at any hour including midnight, the physical demands of the work during the on-watch period, all of these imposed a quality on the rest that made 8 hours in 2 blocks quite different from 8 uninterrupted hours. The sailor's body adapted. The adaptation was real and measurable. The ability to fall asleep quickly, to sleep deeply regardless of noise or motion, to wake fully alert, these were physiological adaptations that sea service produced. They were survival mechanisms. You slept well when you could because you never knew when you would have to be awake. Hygiene at sea was a complicated matter. Fresh water was a precious resource on a sailing ship. The water casks stowed in the hold represented a finite quantity that had to last until the next port or the next opportunity to take on water from a river or rain. Fresh water was managed strictly, so much per person per day for drinking, some additional amount for cooking, and whatever was left after these necessities might be used for washing. In practice, the fresh water available for washing was usually minimal. This meant that the sailor's relationship with bodily cleanliness was quite different from what modern sensibilities would consider comfortable. Salt water was used for washing when fresh water was unavailable, effective for removing the gross accumulation of grime, if not quite the same as a freshwater wash, and it left the skin feeling sticky and slightly damp, as salt does. The clothing that sailors wore was washed, when it was washed, by trailing it behind the ship in the wake, a method that used the ocean itself as the wash basin and was effective at removing gross dirt, though less effective at the finer cleaning that hot water and soap would provide. Clothes dried when hung on lines rigged for the purpose in the rigging, and the salt content of the water in which they had been washed meant that they dried slightly stiff and continued to feel damp even after they were technically dry. The effects of this on health were real. The skin conditions that resulted from constant exposure to salt water and salt air, from imperfectly dried clothing, from cold, from the physical demands of the work, these were a constant background feature of sea service. Chafed skin, particularly around the collar and cuffs where wet cloth rubbed against skin day after day. Blistered hands, callousing over time. The particular redness and roughness that constant sun and salt wind produced on exposed skin. And yet, and this is important, sailors were in many respects genuinely healthy people. The physical work was considerable and it produced strength and cardiovascular fitness. The diet, inadequate in many ways, was at least adequate in calories. The regular, if interrupted sleep was better than no sleep. The diseases of the sea, scurvy above all, but also the various fevers that attacked ships in tropical ports, were the primary threats to sailor health, and these were not products of the lifestyle itself, but of specific nutritional deficiencies and specific disease exposures. A sailor who returned from a long voyage without having been seriously ill was, in many respects, a more robust physical specimen than most of his contemporaries on land. He was stronger, more acclimatized to physical discomfort, and possessed of a very practical, very matter-of-fact relationship with his own body that came from years of treating it as a working instrument rather than an object of comfort. Sleep hygiene, the modern concept, did not exist, but its practical elements were understood. The connection between cleanliness and health was known, even if its mechanisms were not. Ships that were kept cleaner had healthier crews. This was observable, consistent, and acted upon by the better captains and surgeons of the age. The practice of swabbing the decks, those famous holystone decks, scrubbed with soft sandstone and sea water until they were pale and smooth, was partly aesthetic, partly a matter of discipline and pride, but substantially a genuine health measure. Clean, dry deck was less hospitable to the various organisms that thrived in the damp organic material that would otherwise accumulate. The holystoning of decks was done at dawn, at the beginning of the forenoon watch. The men of the morning watch, as the light improved, would spread out over the deck with the flat sandstones and work them back and forth across the planking, sluicing water ahead of them and scrubbing the wood white. The sound of this, the scraping of stone on wood, the splash of water, the rhythmic back and forth, was one of the signature sounds of morning on a naval vessel, so characteristic that it appears in almost every detailed account of shipboard life from the period. The deck smelled of salt water when it was being holystoned. It smelled of clean wood when it was done, and when the sun hit it, it dried quickly, and the pale planking seemed to glow slightly in the morning light. This was the physical starting point of the ship's day, and as the night deepens toward its final passages, and we have now been at sea together for many hours, let us take a slower walk through a final long chapter of the night. Letters Never Sent, The Inner Life of the Sailor. A ship's doctor named Thomas Trotter, writing in 1790, made an observation about the psychology of sailors that has stayed with me since I first read it. He wrote with a physician's careful attention that the sailor's inner life was more complex and more tender than the sailor's outer life suggested, that the man who appeared rough, uncommunicative, indifferent to comfort, was often, in his private hours, deeply attentive to the small things of feeling, that sailors felt their attachment strongly, to ships, to shipmates, to places, to the particular moments that sea life provided. The evidence for this is scattered through the record in ways that require patience to find. The letters that sailors wrote when they could, when they were in port, or when a ship they met in the open ocean was headed for a destination where their letters might be passed on, which was a standard courtesy of the sea. These letters are, when they survive, among the more revealing documents of the period. They are usually short, they are usually practical. They tell you where the ship is and where it is going and when they expect to return, and they contain requests. Please send money, please look after the mother, please tell such and such person such and such thing. They are not literary productions. They were written often in difficult physical conditions by men who were not professional writers with limited time and limited paper. But in the best of them, and in the best passages of even the more mundane ones, there is something that pierces. Particular mention of the light on a particular day. A sentence about missing not something grand, but something very specific and small. The sound of a kettle, or the smell of a garden, or the quality of quiet in a particular room at a particular time of day. These small, specific things are the signs of genuine feeling, of a person who is paying attention to their own experience of being absent from the things they love. The sailors wrote letters in the evening sometimes, when they had paper and ink and there was enough light and enough time. They sat in whatever corner was available to them. The forecastle if that was their space, the wardroom table if they were officers, the captain's desk if they were the captain, and they wrote the letters that might take weeks or months to arrive, that described a world that would have changed by the time the letter was read. Many of the letters were never sent. The ship changed its plans and didn't touch the port where the letter was to be forwarded. The man who was to carry the letter forgot, or lost it, or his own ship went elsewhere. The letter ended up in the bottom of a sea chest, or was read one more time and then thrown over the side, or was kept for some reason and traveled the rest of the voyage with its writer, unused. These undelivered letters are a particular kind of historical artifact. They are addressed to someone and never reach them. They speak out of a past that had no idea we would eventually be listening. What did sailors think about in the evenings, writing these letters, or simply sitting without the means to write? They thought about their families mostly. For many men, the sea represented a geographical and temporal separation from family that was the defining condition of their professional lives. A sailor who spent 8 months of the year at sea and 4 months in port was spending 2/3 of his adult life away from his parents, his siblings, his wife if he had one, his children if he had them. The children grew and changed in his absence, and he returned to find them different from how he remembered them. The parents aged and died sometimes while he was away, and the news came to him weeks or months after the fact, and the grief was complicated by the distance. The sea gave men a lot of time to think about the people they had left behind. It gave them time to remember things with a precision that ordinary life, with its constant present demands, did not allow. The smell of a particular person's hair, the sound of a particular laugh, the exact quality of light in a particular room on a winter afternoon. These memories were kept in the small hours, in the hammock, in the off-watch time, with a care and deliberateness that was almost a form of preservation. As if by remembering clearly enough, the sailor could hold the people he loved in a state of perfect suspension, unchanged and unchanging, waiting for his return. This was, of course, not what was happening on land. The people at home were living their lives at the same pace as always, changing in the way that all people change, adjusting to the absence of the sailor, in ways that the sailor did not always fully understand when he returned. The reunion between a sailor home from a long voyage and the family he had left behind was not always as simple as the memory-keeping had suggested it would be. But in the evening, on the ship in the hammock, it was enough to hold the memory, to keep it clear, to know that the people were there, even at this distance, even across all this water, even through all this darkness. Different ships, different nights, a survey of the maritime world. We have spent most of our time on sailing ships of a particular type, European, primarily British, military or merchant. But the maritime world of history was enormous and various, and a complete picture of nights at sea requires at least a brief glance at some of the other worlds within it. Consider the fishing vessels. The great fishing fleets of the North Atlantic, The English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese vessels that crossed to the Grand Banks off Newfoundland for the cod fishery, from the early 16th century onward, had a very different relationship with the sea knight from the naval and merchant vessels we have been imagining. These were working ships in the most fundamental sense. Their entire purpose was the catching of fish, and the catching of fish did not take time off for nightfall. On the banks, the fishing vessels anchored or hove to, and the men went out in small boats, dories, to set their lines, or they deployed hand lines directly from the ship's deck. The work went on around the clock, because the fish were there, and the season was short and the voyage had to pay. Men fished through the night, hour after hour, pulling in the line and unhooking the cod and throwing the bait back and pulling up the next fish, a process so repetitive that it became, over the course of a long night, almost a kind of trance. The night on the banks had its own quality. The fog was a constant feature of that cold, shallow, current-meeting region, a thick, gray, absolutely silent fog that reduced visibility to a few yards and turned everything wet. Ships on the banks in fog deployed foghorns and bells to warn each other of their presence, and the sounds of these instruments, coming from invisible directions through the fog, created an acoustic landscape that bore no resemblance to anything on land. A fog bell ringing somewhere ahead and to starboard or astern, or somewhere where the fog made direction uncertain. This was the world of the Banks fisherman's night. The fog also created the conditions for disaster. Vessels that could not see each other could run each other down, and the crowded waters of the Grand Banks, with hundreds of fishing vessels from multiple nations all working the same grounds at the same time, produced collisions and near misses as a regular feature of the fishery. The larger vessels were most dangerous to the smaller ones. A large brig under sail, moving through fog, could run down a small dory before either party knew the other was there. Men were lost in these ways, regularly. The fishing communities of Gloucester in Massachusetts, of Yarmouth and Grimsby in England, of Brittany in France, knew this intimately. The deaths were not dramatic recorded history. They were local news repeated year after year. A boat overdue from the banks, a dory found floating empty, a name added to the list that every fishing port kept, the list that grew longer through the generations, the whaling ships. The American whaling industry of the 18th and 19th centuries, centered on Nantucket and New Bedford, produced some of the most remarkable sea voyages in history. These were voyages of years rather than months, 3, 4, sometimes more than 4 years at sea, pursuing the sperm whale and the right whale through every ocean on Earth. The men who shipped on these voyages were committing themselves to an absence from land that dwarfed anything in the experience of ordinary merchant or naval sailors. The nights on a whaling ship were, for the most part, the same as the nights on any other ship: the watch system, the hammocks, the food, the dark. But the whale hunt itself created a different rhythm, a different quality of attention. During a whale hunt, time was suspended in a particular way. The whaling ship was searching constantly, day and night, with lookouts posted at the mastheads who watched the horizon for the blow, that distant spout of vapor that indicated a whale at the surface. The cry of "there she blows" from the masthead could come at any hour, and when it came, everything changed immediately. The boats were lowered, the crews took their places, the oars hit the water, and the hunt began. This could happen at night. Whales did not respect human working hours, and a night whale hunt, the boats moving through dark water toward a sound and a faint disturbance in the darkness, the whaleman straining to see, the harpooner in the bow trying to get close enough, was one of the more dangerous and disorienting experiences that the sea could produce. The whale was in its element. The men were in their element only in the most partial sense. The quiet nights on a whaling ship between hunts had a particular quality of waiting. You were always waiting on a whaling ship, waiting for the blow, for the cry from the masthead, for the event that would make the voyage profitable. The economy of whaling was such that a voyage without sufficient whale oil was a voyage that had not paid, and the pressure of this could be felt in the silences of the off-watch hours, the slave ships. I will not spend long here, because the complexity and the horror of this topic deserve more than a brief treatment, but to speak of the history of ships at night and omit this entirely would be a serious dishonesty. The slave ships, the vessels of the transatlantic slave trade that operated from the 16th to the 19th centuries, carrying enslaved Africans from the coasts of West Africa to the Americas, existed within the same physical framework as the merchant and naval vessels we have been describing. They had watch systems, they had officers and crews, they had the same wooden hulls and canvas sails and rope rigging. But the nature of their cargo transformed the experience of everyone on board, and the nights on those ships were unlike the nights on any other vessel. The people in the hold of a slave ship were not willing passengers or voluntary sailors. They were prisoners, confined in conditions of extreme overcrowding, inadequate ventilation, inadequate food and water, subject to violence, separated from family and community and everything they knew. Their suffering was enormous and not incidental but structural. It was the premise of the entire enterprise. The crew on slave ships knew what they were doing, and the accounts that survive from those who later wrote about their experience suggest a range of responses. Those who normalized it, those who were troubled by it, those who were actively cruel, and those who tried to moderate the worst aspects within the constraints of the system they were participating in. None of them changed what it was. The nights on those ships were long, for everyone on board, in ways that had nothing to do with the watch system or the quality of the food or the comfort of the sleeping arrangements. I will say no more about this, except that it was part of the same ocean, the same darkness, the same history that we have been exploring tonight. The quiet HOURS before dawn, a return to the ordinary night, and as the night deepens toward its final passages, let us return to the quieter story. Let us return to the ship we know best by now, our imagined composite of the age of sail, somewhere in the open ocean, in moderate weather in the middle of the night. The middle watch is in its final hour. The men on deck are cold and tired but managing. The officer of the watch has stopped pacing and is standing at the rail, looking at the sea. The helmsman is steady, his hands on the wheel. The lookout at the bow has been on station for 4 hours now and is keeping his vigil. Below in the forecastle, the men of the first watch are well into their sleep. The forecastle is warm from their bodies and quiet except for the sounds of breathing and the sounds of the ship. The lamp has burned very low, it will go out soon, or the wick will need adjusting. The hammocks move in small arcs as the ship moves. One man is not quite asleep. He has been lying in his hammock for a couple of hours, drifting in and out of sleep, not quite able to sink fully into it. This happens sometimes. Usually he sleeps immediately, reliably, but sometimes, after a particularly trying watch or when something is on his mind, or for no reason he can identify, the sleep comes slowly or not at all. He lies on his back and listens. The water, very close on the other side of the planking inches from his head. That slow, surging movement, the water riding up the curve of the hull and drawing back, riding up and drawing back. The sound of it is so familiar that he usually doesn't hear it, the way you stop hearing the clock in a room you spend all your time in. But now, lying in the dark, not quite asleep, he hears it. The timbers moving. A very slight, very regular creak somewhere aft, deeper in the ship, probably one of the frames shifting fractionally under the stress of the ship's movement. A sound that has been there since the ship was launched. A sound that will be there until the ship is broken up. He knows this sound. He doesn't have a name for it, but he knows it, the way he knows all the sounds of the ship. He knows that it is nothing to worry about. The bell, 3 bells, which means 1:30 in the morning, which means an hour and a half until the watch changes. He will be woken for the morning watch at 4. He has 2 hours and a half of sleep still available to him if he can take it. He shifts slightly in the hammock. The canvas adjusts around him. Somewhere nearby, a man is snoring, not loudly, just a regular, soft, underwater sound. This is familiar too. He thinks briefly about home. He thinks about a meal he had once in a particular place, the specific smell of the food and the quality of the light in the room and the sound of voices around him. He holds this for a moment, clear and complete like something precious. Then it begins to fade and the sounds of the ship come back and the hammock sways and his breathing slows. He sleeps. Above him on the deck, the officer of the watch is looking at the stars. Specifically, he is looking at a group of stars on the southern horizon that he has been watching for the past hour, not because they require watching, but because there is something pleasing in the watching. He knows these stars by name. He knows most of the significant stars by name, knows their positions, their colors, their uses in navigation. But this is not navigation. This is something simpler. He is watching the stars because it is 3 in the morning and the ship is sailing well and the watch is quiet, and the stars are the most interesting thing available to look at. They are very still, the stars. Of course they move, the whole celestial sphere rotates through the night, each star tracing its arc from east to west, so that the positions of stars 4 hours apart are clearly different if you are paying attention. But they move slowly enough that in the span of a few minutes, they seem fixed, permanent. The only genuinely permanent things in a world that is otherwise entirely in motion. He thinks, as naval officers of the period often did, those who had learned their navigation from books, about the distances involved. The nearest stars are unimaginably far away, at distances that could be stated in numbers, but could not really be felt. He had read a number once, in a book on astronomy that a fellow officer had brought aboard, and the number had been so large that it passed through him without leaving any impression, the way very large and very small numbers do. But the stars themselves, as he looks at them now, communicate distance in a different way, through their very quality of permanence, their impossibility of approach, their utter indifference to the ship below them. He is 31 years old. He has been at sea since he was 12. He will be at sea for most of the rest of his life. This is not a source of sadness to him. It is simply what his life is. He paces. The ship sails on. The SAILORS of other nations, a broader world we have been, for most of this night, in the world of the English-speaking sailor. This is partly a matter of historical convenience. The English language record is the most accessible to the narrator, but it is worth acknowledging that the sea was always a cosmopolitan world. The great ports of the Age of Sail were among the most diverse places in the world. Portsmouth, Bristol, London, Amsterdam, Lisbon, Cadiz, Marseille, Boston, New York. In these ports, you would find men from every maritime nation on earth, speaking a dozen languages, following a dozen religions, carrying with them the specific customs and habits and songs and stories of their various homes. On merchant ships, the crews were frequently mixed. An English merchant vessel might carry sailors from the Dutch coast, from Scandinavia, from the Caribbean, from the various ports of the Mediterranean. The working language of the ship was usually whatever language the captain spoke, but among themselves the men spoke whatever they spoke, and the ship carried the ambient sound of several languages existing alongside each other. The Mediterranean sailors, the men of the Venetian trading republic, the Spanish and Genoese and Greek and Ottoman mariners who had been navigating those ancient waters since before Rome existed, had their own traditions, their own rhythms, their own relationship with the sea night. The Mediterranean has its own character, that enclosed sea with its distinctive blue, its particular calms and its sudden, violent storms, its network of islands and coasts that meant you were rarely out of sight of land for very long. The navigation was different, more complex in some ways, with more hazards, more intimate with specific geography. The food was different. The culture of the ship was different. A Venetian galleot in the 16th century, moving cargo between Crete and Constantinople. The oarsmen, if it was an oared vessel, as many Mediterranean ships still were in that period, rested at night, chained to their benches if they were slaves, sleeping if they could, the ship anchored in some sheltered bay or continuing under sail if the wind was favorable. The officers ate their supper under a canopy at the stern and drank their wine and watched the lights of the coast if there was a coast. The night insects of the Mediterranean coast, cicadas and things that chirred in the dark, came over the water in a warm wind, mixed with the smell of thyme and rock and salt. Very far from the North Atlantic, and further still, the Chinese junks of the South China Sea, with their distinctive battened sails and their eyes painted on the bow so that the ship could see where it was going. The Arab dhows of the Indian Ocean, their triangular lateen sails always tilted at that characteristic angle, moving through the warm blue-black water of the monsoon ocean on routes that had been sailed for 1,000 years before anyone on the other side of the world had worked out that the planet was round. Polynesian voyaging canoes, the most remarkable deep-water sailing vessels ever built for their time, navigating the vast Pacific by stars and waves and the flight of birds, finding islands that no chart described because there was no chart. All of these were nights at sea. All of these were the same darkness, the same stars, the same ocean that everyone who has ever sailed has shared. The details differ enormously. The experience at its core is the same: water, darkness, the wooden or reed or carved hull beneath you, the sky above, the people around you, the sound of the sea. The end of the age, the coming of steam. We should note before we close that the world we have been describing had an end. The age of sail did not end all at once. It faded over the course of the 19th century as steam engines became more reliable and more economical, and the great steamships began to replace the sailing vessels on the major ocean routes. The transition was gradual and uneven. Sailing ships continued to be built and operated well into the late 19th century, particularly for bulk cargo, grain, timber, coal, where the speed advantage of steam was less important than the economy of the running costs. Last great sailing ships, the four-masted barks of the grain trade, were still operating in the early 20th century, but the texture of the night at sea changed as steam came in. On a steamship, the night had a different quality. The engine was always present, its vibration a constant sensation through every surface of the ship, its sound a constant deep thrum beneath all other sounds, its smoke visible against the night sky and its smell present in the air. The relationship with the wind was different. A steamship did not sail by the wind, it pushed through it. The wind, which on a sailing ship was the force that moved everything, on a steamship was an obstacle to be overcome, a thing that slowed progress, a fact of weather to be taken into account in the coal calculations. The watch system continued because the sea was the sea and the night was the night, and ships still had to be navigated and watched, but the work of the watch was different. The man at the helm of a steamship was not listening to the sails. He was reading the compass and the engine room telegraph. The lookout at the bow was watching for what the lookout always watched for, but the ship he was on was making noise that a sailing vessel did not make, and the engines that drove it could be felt in the deck under his feet. The hammock disappeared. Steamships, with their more regular schedule and their ability to carry more supplies more efficiently, began to provide fixed berths for their crews, first in the officers' quarters and eventually for the common sailors as well. The forecastle remained cramped and low-ceilinged, but the hammocks gave way to wooden bunks stacked 2 or 3 high, and the relationship between the sailor and his sleeping space changed. Some sailors mourned the hammock. It is always possible to find, in the accounts of men who made the transition from sail to steam, a particular nostalgia for the old way of sleeping, the way the hammock moved with the ship, the way it held you, the particular quality of rest it provided. But change came, as it always does, and the sounds of the steam engine replaced the sounds of the rigging, and the smell of coal smoke mixed with the smell of salt, and the age of sail became history. The last hours of night, coming toward dawn, and now let us come slowly toward the end of this long night. We have been out here a long time. We have watched the sun go down and the stars come out and the watches change and the men sleep and wake and sleep again. We have been in the forecastle and the captain's cabin and the wardroom and the sick berth. We have followed the middle watch through its long cold hours and seen the dawn begin to assemble itself on the eastern horizon. It is now about 5 in the morning. The morning watch has been on duty for an hour. The night is still mostly present, the sky still dark in the west, but the east is beginning its slow transformation. The stars are not gone yet, the horizon is not yet clear, but there is something in the air, some indefinable change in the quality of the darkness that signals what is coming. The officer of the morning watch is aware of this. He has kept morning watches for years. He knows the particular feeling of an hour before dawn, the way the darkness changes its character from the pure, settled dark of midnight to something less complete, something with an edge to it, something that is already not quite as dark as it was. The helmsman has been at the wheel for most of the watch. He will be relieved soon. The lookout at the bow has been on station since 4, and he is cold and a little stiff, and he is watching the eastern horizon very carefully because this is the hour when the first light will come and the horizon will appear, and for a few minutes there is a particular quality of visibility, a kind of enhanced clarity, very brief, that comes just before the sky becomes too bright and before the sun rises, when the horizon is perfect, absolutely clear. And the distance can be seen as far as it can ever be seen. The ship is sailing well. The wind is from the west-northwest, a moderate breeze, and the sails are set correctly for it, and the ship is moving at a comfortable pace through the long Atlantic swells. The sound of the water along the hull is that regular, slightly rhythmic sound that you know by now, that you have been listening to for hours. The rigging makes its low sound in the wind. Below in the forecastle, the last sleepers of the night are in their final period of sleep before they are called. These are the men of the middle watch who came below at 4 and have been sleeping for an hour. They have perhaps 3 more hours before the ship's routine requires them again. They are as deeply asleep as they will be. The ship's bell will not ring for another 30 minutes. The forecastle is quiet. The lamp has burned out and the darkness is complete and warm. The breathing of the sleeping men is slow and regular. The hammocks sway in tiny arcs. The sounds of the ship come through the hull and the deckhead, familiar and continuous, the permanent ambient sound of this world, this life. And as the night deepens toward the dawn that is coming, let us stay here for a moment, right here, in the forecastle in the dark with the sleeping men around us and the sounds of the ship in the sea. We have been here a long time. We know this place now. We know the smell of it and the sound of it and the quality of darkness in it. We know the feel of the hammock and the weight of the blanket and the way the ship moves. There is something about spending a long time with the small details of a lost world that changes how you see it. Not the dates and the battles and the names of captains and ships, but this, the actual texture of how it felt to live that life. The cold of the night watch, the warmth of the forecastle, the grog ration, the letter never sent, the star that the officer was watching while the watch slept below, these things. The people who lived these lives are gone. The ships are gone. The sea itself has changed, at least in the narrow sense that there are no more vessels like these on it, no more men sleeping in hammocks while the wooden hull groans around them, no more fires being lit in iron grates for the morning porridge. The age of sail has passed entirely into history, but the sea is still there. The sea is exactly the same sea. The same depth, the same darkness, the same cold. The stars are in the same positions relative to the water that they have been in for all of recorded history. The waves still move in the same direction the wind pushes them, and still make the same sound against whatever hull is in their way. The continuity between then and now is in the sea itself. It witnessed all of this. It was the setting for all of these lives, and all of these nights, and all of these small human moments that we have been visiting together. And it is there still, indifferent and vast and faintly luminous at night with the reflection of the stars, moving as it always has. The slow fade, coming to rest, we are coming to the end of our night. The dawn is coming. You can see it now, a clear, pale line on the eastern horizon, growing by degrees, the darkness above it lightening from black to deep blue to a soft, clear indigo that will in time become the actual blue of the morning sky. The stars in the east are fading. One by one they withdraw, the fainter ones first, then the brighter ones, until only the very brightest remain, Venus, perhaps, or Jupiter, standing alone in the lightning sky like the last guest at a party who doesn't want to leave. The sea in this first light is the color of pewter. The waves are the same waves they have been all night, but they look different now, softer, more clearly three-dimensional, the troughs and crests making real shadows for the first time since sunset. The white of the wave crests is genuinely white now, not the pale gray of starlight, but the real white of foam in early morning light. The ship is going somewhere. It has always been going somewhere through all this night. The course was set and the course has been held and the miles have accumulated behind the ship in its wake, and wherever it is going, it is now closer to it than it was when we came aboard. The helmsman at the wheel looks ahead at the lightening horizon. The officer of the morning watch checks his compass and his sails and makes a note in his log. The time, the position as best he can estimate it, the weather, the course and speed, small marks in a column, ink on paper, the record of a night at sea. Below in the forecastle, the last sleepers have an hour before the cook begins the morning, and the smells of breakfast come down the hatch, and the sounds of the day watch's activity on deck begin to filter through the deckhead. An hour more, the men sleep, the hammocks move. The ship moves, the sea moves, and the light comes. Slowly, the way all light comes at sea, not all at once but in increments, each one almost imperceptible, each one slightly more than the one before, until suddenly you notice that it is light, properly light, daylight, and the transition has happened so gradually that you cannot say quite when it crossed from night to day. The horizon in the east is now gold. A deep, warm, entirely different gold from the orange and pink of sunset. This is the gold of the actual sun approaching, the gold that precedes the sun by just a few minutes, that colors the undersides of any clouds there might be and turns the sea ahead of the ship into something that looks briefly as if it were lit from below. And then the sun, just a sliver at first, a brilliant, unbearable sliver of light at the exact point where the horizon meets the sky. Then more. The sun coming up out of the sea the way the sun always comes up out of the sea when you are far enough from land, rising from the water itself, as if the ocean had been keeping it, as if the ocean gives and takes back the sun every day, and has been doing this since before anyone was there to watch. The deck fills with light. The sails, which had been pale shapes against the dark sky, are now the color they actually are, cream and brown and slightly gray with the weathering, the patches visible, the careful repairs to storm-torn places, the practical patchwork of canvas that had been sewing and resewing since the ship was last in port. They fill with the light of the morning, and they are beautiful in the way that practical things can be beautiful when you have spent a long time with them. On the forecastle, a man comes up through the hatch. He is one of the morning watch, awake early by habit, coming on deck before he needs to, drawn by some instinct toward the morning. He stands at the rail and looks at the sun. He has seen this sunrise, or one very like it, hundreds of times. It is not special, it is not remarkable. It is the ordinary beginning of the ordinary day, but he looks at it. For a moment, just a moment, he is entirely present in the morning, the sun on his face after the long dark of the night. The smell of the sea in the clean morning air, the sound of the ship, the same sounds it has been making all night, but different somehow in the light, less anonymous, more intimate. He is a sailor. He is somewhere in the middle of the ocean. He has been at sea for many weeks. He will be at sea for many more. He watches the sun. It comes up out of the water, clear and whole, and it sends its first full light across the waves, and the shadows behind every wave become sharp and meaningful for a moment, and then the sun is properly up and the shadows begin to lengthen in the other direction and the day has begun. He goes about his work. The men below sleep a little longer, and then the bell rings, one bell, two bells of the forenoon watch, the morning settling into its routine, and the day is fully present, and the night is. But the night was here, all of it, all those hours, all those people, all those small moments of cold and warmth, of memory and watching, of sleep and waking and sleep again. The night was here and we were here in it, and now it is morning. The ship sails on, the sea is wide, the morning light is on the water, and so we come to shore in the gentlest way. We have traveled a long distance tonight, not across any ocean, but through a kind of time, through the long, slow, deeply human hours of the maritime night. We have been in the forecastle and on the quarterdeck, in the sick berth in the captain's cabin. We have heard the bell and the rigging and the water against the hull. We have seen the stars come out and watched them arc across the sky and begin to fade in the morning. What we have found, at the heart of all of it, is something very simple. People sleeping on a moving vessel in the dark, doing their best with what they had, caring about the people they had left behind and the people around them, doing their work as well as they could in conditions that were often difficult and sometimes beautiful and occasionally both at the same time. The sea is very old, and the ships are mostly gone, and the men who sailed them are all gone, every one. But the record of how they lived persists, in the logs and the letters and the medical journals and the memoirs, and if you look at it carefully enough and slowly enough and in the right kind of quiet, you can hear something in it. The sound of water against a wooden hull, the bell at midnight, the wind in the rigging at 3 a.m, a man in a hammock asleep, the ship moving through the dark ocean toward a shore he cannot yet see but knows is there. Good night.